Hey there, tonight we're exploring why you wouldn't last a day in a Viking settlement. Think less horned helmets and more grueling chores, because the truth is, your biggest battle might just be with the daily grind of Norse life. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. If you've ever fantasized about waking up as a Viking, brace yourself for a reality check that even Thor might find hard to handle. The sun barely creeps over the horizon, casting a pale, reluctant light across the landscape. You're not waking up on a luxurious longship deck, but in a cramped, smoky longhouse, probably sharing your space with extended family, a couple of goats, and whatever other livestock survived the night. Privacy isn't just a luxury here, it's a mythical concept. First things first, personal hygiene. Forget your morning ritual of toothpaste, hot showers, and deodorant. Instead, you're greeted by the earthy scent of yesterday's sweat, mixed with the aroma of smoke from the central hearth. Daily baths are a distant dream, unless you're one of the lucky few living near a hot spring. Water is a precious commodity, often too scarce for frivolous washing when it's needed for drinking, cooking, and keeping livestock alive. Speaking of water, ever tried breaking the ice on a bucket of it first thing in the morning? Welcome to the fierce Scandinavian climate. With winter temperatures plummeting to degrees Celsius, your refreshing morning splash feels more like a Viking ice bucket challenge. And let's talk about the wind. It doesn't just breeze by, it slaps you across the face like a battle-hardened warrior, reminding you who's boss. As you step outside, the day's responsibilities hit you like an avalanche. Forget the Hollywood image of horned-helmeted warriors raiding by day and feasting by night. What they don't show you is how these rugged folks started their mornings. The settlement is a hive of activity. Early risers, farmers, blacksmiths, and their families are already hard at work. You think coffee is essential to kickstart your day? Try the Viking version, a hearty breakfast of porridge, dried fish, or whatever's left over from last night's supper. No espresso machine here, just the robust flavors of reality. Now, about those chores. You're not just lounging around with a tankard of mead. The myth of the carefree Viking warrior. Absolute nonsense. In truth, every hand is needed to keep the community running. You might find yourself feeding livestock, repairing tools, or helping with the all-important task of securing food for the winter. Scarcity isn't an abstract concept. It's a constant threat. If the livestock isn't thriving, neither are you. A single cow or a couple of sheep could mean the difference between making it through the winter or facing starvation. Your day is dictated by the relentless cycle of seasons. Agriculture isn't just back-breaking work, it's a high-stakes gamble against nature. The growing season is short, so every moment counts. Crops must be sown and harvested with military precision. And don't get me started on the soil. It's as stubborn as a Norse saga hero, requiring constant attention to yield anything worth mentioning. Resource management is a fine art here. Every tool, every piece of clothing, every scrap of food must be used wisely. Recycling isn't a trend, it's a necessity. That broken axe head, you're not tossing it, you're fixing it. Those worn-out clothes, they're getting patched up and passed down. Waste is an enemy as feared as any rival clan. But let's not forget the social dynamics of the settlement. It's not just about survival. It's about maintaining a complex web of relationships. Forget about the romantic image of Viking egalitarianism. While women did enjoy certain freedoms unheard of elsewhere in medieval Europe, life here was still a structured affair. Social hierarchies were as rigid as the North Sea in winter, with chieftains and their kin at the top, and thralls, essentially slaves, at the bottom. Your place in this hierarchy affects everything from your living arrangements to your daily duties. By the time you've finished your morning rounds, you've already experienced more hardship than a whole season of reality TV contestants. The harshness of this life is a reminder that the Vikings' legendary toughness wasn't just for show. It was a survival strategy. Sure, you've heard about their epic voyages and daring raids, but those were only occasional adventures. The real Viking life was this: relentless, grueling work just to keep the frost at bay and the family fed. And so, as you wrap up your morning, you're left to ponder the reality of Viking life. The air is filled with the sound of hammers on anvils, the bleating of sheep, and the distant laughter of children playing in the dirt. It's a world away from the romanticized tales of yore, but it's all the more remarkable for its gritty authenticity. As you steel yourself for the rest of the day, one thing is clear: living in a Viking settlement isn't for the faint of heart. As the clamor of morning chores fades and the sun climbs a little higher, let's dive headlong into the economic engine of Viking society. Spoiler alert, it's not all about plundering. Sure, those daring raids across the North Sea to England, Ireland, or the Frankish coast make for thrilling tales. But if you think every day was spent sharpening axes for the next raid, you've been sold a saga-sized lie. Most of the time, Vikings were trading, not raiding. Picture this: a bustling marketplace, not unlike your local farmer's market, but with more fur and fewer kombucha stands. Trade was the lifeblood of these communities, connecting remote settlements to a vast network that stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the steamy bazaars of Baghdad. And just like that, we see the Vikings not as isolated barbarians, but as savvy merchants who could haggle with the best of them. Silver, the bling of the medieval world, was the currency of choice. Forget gold, silver was where it's at. In fact, the silver economy was so robust that Viking traders would often carry small scales and weights to ensure they weren't being shortchanged, literally. Coins were sometimes cut into smaller pieces, known as hack silver, to make exact payments. Imagine paying for your groceries by chipping off a piece of your coin. That's commitment to precision. The Vikings were no slouches when it came to navigating the complex world of trade routes, either. They weren't just crossing the North Sea. They were deftly maneuvering through the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga and Dnieper, like aquatic highways. These routes linked them to the Byzantine Empire and even the Islamic caliphates, where they traded everything from furs and timber to slaves and honey. The world was a Viking oyster, and they pried it open with determination and a keen eye for opportunity. Now, let's talk about the role of women in this economic tapestry. While Hollywood might have you believe Viking women were solely damsels or shield maidens, the reality is they were formidable players in commerce. Women often ran the home farms, managed local trade, and were even known to wield considerable influence over family wealth, sometimes more than their sword-wielding husbands. In many settlements, women were in charge of the production and trading of textiles, a crucial commodity. A well-woven cloak wasn't just a fashion statement, it was currency. This brings us to another myth begging to be busted: the idea that Viking warriors were the primary breadwinners. Sure, warriors had their place, but they were just one part of a much larger machine. The reality, it was a communal effort. Every hand, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, contributed to the economic engine. Crafting, farming, and trading were all in a day's work, and everyone had a role to play. Even the thralls, or slaves, were an integral part of this system, performing labor-intensive tasks that kept the settlement running smoothly. Craftsmanship was another vital cog in the Viking economic wheel. Blacksmiths, weavers, and carpenters were as essential as the warriors who wielded their creations. Tools had to be forged, ships built, and clothes woven. Each was a master of their craft, producing goods not just for survival, but for trade as well. Those intricately designed brooches and arm rings you see in museums today, they weren't just decorative, they were advertisements of skill and wealth. The communal nature of Viking settlements meant that survival depended on everyone pulling their weight. This wasn't a society where you could afford to slack off. The seasonal cycle dictated the rhythm of life, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Miss a planting season or lose a boat to the elements, and the whole community could suffer. Yet, amidst the hard work and the ceaseless grind, There was a certain romance to the Viking lifestyle, a fierce independence, a connection to the land and sea, and a spirit of adventure that propelled them to the ends of the known world. It's this duality that captivates us, the gritty reality of daily life set against the backdrop of legendary exploits. So, as you wrap your head around the economic realities of Viking life, remember this. While the allure of the Viking Age might be the thrill of conquest and the call of distant shores, the real heart of their society lay in the everyday efforts of ordinary people. From the thrall to the chieftain, each played a part in a complex economic web that was as vital to their survival as any battle axe. And while their stories are often overshadowed by tales of warriors and gods, it's these unsung heroes who kept the Viking world turning. Now, let's shift gears and dive into the social and political machinery that kept Viking society humming, or more accurately, clashing swords in the thing. Forget any notions of a Viking utopia where everyone's voice was equal. The thing was the assembly where free men, emphasis on men and free, gathered to settle disputes, deliberate laws, and flex their societal muscles. Think of it as a medieval town hall meeting, but with more axes and fewer PowerPoint slides. The thing wasn't exactly a democratic paradise. Sure, it had elements that might make a modern-day politician nod approvingly, like community participation and consensus building. But don't get carried away on a longship of idealism. This wasn't an open mic night at the local mead hall. The power dynamics were firmly anchored by the chieftains, those top dogs whose status was built on a cocktail of wealth, martial prowess, and strategic bloodlines. These guys were the original influencers, except instead of Instagram followers, they had loyal warriors and a knack for navigating Viking politics. And speaking of chieftains, let's talk about the alpha males of the Viking world. Within the thing, chieftains wielded significant clout, their influence as solid as a well-forged sword. They were master negotiators, deal-makers, and at times, the ultimate deciders in disputes. Their leadership wasn't just about swinging swords. It was about swinging deals and alliances. If you think modern politicians have a monopoly on backroom deals, think again. Vikings were playing the Game of Thrones when the real thing was still centuries away. But the thing wasn't just a playground for the elite. It was a stage where the social hierarchy played out in real time. Free men could voice their opinions, if they were brave enough to risk drawing the ire of more powerful neighbors. Thralls, meanwhile, were about as likely to speak at the thing as a snowball is to survive in Muspelheim. Their rights were as frozen as the Nordic winter, and their voices as silent as a longhouse at midnight. So, why bother with the thing at all? Well, it was crucial to maintaining the delicate balance in Viking society. Laws were more than just words carved into wood. They were the glue holding everything together. Disputes over land, inheritance, and honor often teetered on the edge of violence. The thing provided a forum where grievances could be aired before they escalated into full-blown feuds. Think of it as early conflict resolution with a twist of Norse drama. Let's not pretend it was all about maintaining peace, though. The thing was also a showcase of power. Chieftains used it to flaunt their influence, rally support, and occasionally intimidate rivals. Politics was a blood sport, and the thing was the arena. Chieftains who could deftly handle the rough and tumble of Viking politics were as respected as the fiercest warriors. They understood that the real battle wasn't always fought with swords, but with strategy and savvy. Now, let's bust another myth while we're at it, the notion of Viking egalitarianism. Yes, it's true that Viking women had more rights than many of their contemporaries in medieval Europe. They could own property, request a divorce, and wield considerable influence in the domestic sphere. But don't mistake that for gender equality. The thing was overwhelmingly male-dominated, with women rarely having a say in public affairs. Their power was often indirect, exerted through family connections or whispered counsel rather than public proclamation. And what about the laws themselves? Viking law was a fascinating blend of tradition and pragmatism, with roots reaching back to the sagas of old. It covered everything from inheritance rights to blood feuds, with penalties that would make even the toughest modern judge raise an eyebrow. Fines were common, but so were more severe punishments like outlawry, a sentence that effectively turned the offender into a medieval outcast. Imagine being declared persona non grata in a society where community meant survival. It was as good as a death sentence for many. The thing also played a vital role in maintaining the social fabric. It was a place where news was exchanged, alliances forged, and reputations built or destroyed. For young warriors looking to make a name for themselves, the thing was the perfect platform to demonstrate their worth. A well-timed boast or a clever argument could win allies and bolster one's standing in the community. Yet, despite its imperfections, the thing was an integral part of Viking society. It was a reflection of their values and priorities, a place where the chaos of everyday life met the order of governance. It was both a safeguard and a stage, where the drama of human ambition and the need for communal harmony played out in equal measure. So, as you contemplate the midday hustle and bustle of a Viking settlement, remember that beneath the veneer of adventure and conquest lay a society grappling with the same challenges we face today. The balance of power, the rule of law, and the eternal struggle between individual ambition and collective good. These were the real battles of the Viking Age, fought not just with weapons, but with words and deeds. And as you ponder the complexities of Viking life, consider this. While their world may seem distant, the echoes of their struggles still resonate in our own. As you take a breather from the morning's hustle, you might find yourself drawn into the softer side of Viking life, a realm where axes are exchanged for tales, and the rough edge of survival is softened by cultural richness. Imagine an afternoon in the glow of the hearth, where storytelling isn't just an art, but a vital thread in the tapestry of Viking society. Forget Netflix. This is old-school binge-watching, complete with sagas that could rival any epic series. Let's start with storytelling. In a world without written novels or streaming services, the oral tradition was king. The Skalds, those masterful poets, were the rock stars of their age, wielding words with the same precision as a warrior's sword. Through them, the sagas came alive, tales of gods and giants, of heroic feats and tragic downfalls. These weren't just idle yarns. They were the moral compass and historical record of the Norse people, passed down like precious heirlooms. The ability to memorize and recite these epic tales was a revered skill, not unlike the respect we might afford a Shakespearean actor or a top-tier podcaster today. And here's where we bust a myth: Vikings as unlettered brutes. In reality, they were surprisingly literate. Enter the runes. These angular characters, etched into stone, wood, and metal, were the writing system of the Norse. Used for everything from marking territory to casting spells, runes were the snapshot of their day, concise, powerful, and often ephemeral. The Futhark, the runic alphabet, was more than just a means of communication. It was imbued with magical significance. Carving runes was like casting a spell, each stroke a deliberate act of intent. If you're thinking, just another alphabet, think again. These symbols carried the weight of history and mystery, a language of both the mundane and the mystical. Religious practices were another cornerstone of Viking culture, a complex dance between pagan beliefs and the creeping influence of Christianity. The Norse pantheon was as colorful as it was formidable, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja presiding over their respective domains. But these weren't distant deities. They were intimately involved in the daily lives of the Vikings, invoked for everything from a successful harvest to victory in battle. Sacrifices, often of animals and sometimes of a more grisly nature, were made to gain favor or appease these gods. The rituals were deeply embedded in the rhythm of life, marking everything from births to funerals with a ceremonial nod to the divine. Yet, as the Viking Age progressed, so too did the influence of Christianity. By the 11th century, many Norse communities were grappling with this new faith, which promised salvation and eternal life, a rather tempting offer compared to the uncertainty of Valhalla. The transition wasn't smooth or swift, but more of a cultural tug-of-war. Churches began to appear alongside ancient pagan sites, and some Norse even hedged their bets by worshipping both old gods and the Christian one. Talk about covering all your bases. This religious shift also brought about changes in social customs and governance, as Christian monks started recording laws and history, providing a written record that would eventually outlast the oral traditions. It was a time of great upheaval, where the old ways met the new head-on, and the Vikings found themselves at a crossroads of identity and belief. Family life was the bedrock of Viking society, and contrary to popular belief, it wasn't solely a testosterone-fueled fraternity. Women played a crucial role, not just in the home, but also in the community. While the men were off trading or raiding, women managed the farm and household, making critical decisions that kept the community running smoothly. They wielded significant influence, not just as mothers and wives, but as landowners and traders. In fact, archaeological finds show that women were often buried with keys, symbolizing their role as keepers of the household and guardians of the family wealth. The importance of kinship cannot be overstated. Family ties dictated alliances, property rights, and social status. Marriages were often arranged to strengthen family bonds or secure political alliances, with love sometimes taking a backseat to strategy. But don't let that fool you into thinking these unions were loveless. The sagas are filled with stories of deep affection and loyalty, showing that while strategic, these relationships could also be profoundly personal. So, as afternoon fades into evening, and the communal longhouse fills with the warmth of shared stories and the aroma of a communal meal, you begin to see the Vikings in a new light. These were not just warriors and traders, but poets and philosophers, with a rich cultural heritage that belied their fearsome reputation. The reality of Viking life was far more nuanced than the Hollywood image of helmeted barbarians pillaging their way through history. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows on this world of contradictions, one thing becomes clear. The Vikings were as complex as any society, with a cultural depth that challenges the simplistic narratives often painted by history. Whether through the power of their sagas, the mystery of their runes, or the evolving tapestry of their beliefs, the Norse people left an indelible mark on the world. And as you reflect on this intricate tapestry of life, you can't help but wonder what other layers of Viking life remain to be uncovered. And just as you're ready to hang up your helmet and call it a day, the real Viking magic begins, the communal feast. The longhouse, that cozy albeit smoke-filled hub of activity, transforms into a vibrant tapestry of clinking mugs, hearty laughter, and the aroma of simmering stew. Forget any images of tables groaning under the weight of endless roasted meat and overflowing mead horns. Real Viking feasts were more about resourcefulness than extravagance. Sure, there might be a roasted pig or two on a special occasion, but day-to-day fare was as practical as a Viking ship's design, efficient and no nonsense. The evening meal in a Viking settlement was a community affair. Everyone gathered around the central hearth, which doubled as the kitchen stove, social hub, and heating system. The menu was dictated by the seasons and what was available, a far cry from the mythical never-ending banquet. If you were expecting a Game of Thrones-style feast, adjust your expectations to something more like a potluck dinner, where everyone brings something to the table, literally. Meat was a luxury, not a staple, and more often than not, the stew was heavy on root vegetables and grains like barley or rye. On special occasions, think weddings, successful raids, or a particularly good harvest, there might be some lamb or beef. But most days, fish, dairy, and whatever vegetables survived the harsh climate were the stars of the show. And let's not forget the beverage of choice, mead, the drink of the gods, or so the legends say. This honey-based brew was indeed a favorite, but it wasn't the only option on the Viking drinks menu. Beer made from barley or oats was more common, and sometimes even buttermilk made an appearance. Wine was a rarity, imported from the south, and reserved for the chieftain's table. A bit of a letdown if you were hoping for endless mead horns being passed around like in a Marvel movie. But hey, nothing says authenticity like a slightly sour ale. As the evening progresses, the feast becomes an exercise in leisure and lore. Storytelling takes center stage, with tales of gods and heroes echoing through the longhouse. It's a time when the skalds earn their keep, weaving words into captivating tales that hold the listeners spellbound. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They're lessons, history, and social glue all rolled into one. They reaffirm the values of courage, loyalty, and cunning that the Vikings held dear. And for those who have had a pint or two of that robust ale, the stories might even inspire a boast or a challenge, keeping the community's spirit as lively as a Norse saga. But beneath the joviality lies the pragmatic heart of Viking society. Feasts were as much about strategy as they were about celebration. They reinforced alliances, settled disputes, and provided a platform for chieftains to display their wealth and generosity, an essential part of maintaining their status. When resources were scarce, a feast was a calculated investment in social stability, a way to ensure loyalty and cooperation in the tough months ahead. It was Viking social capital at its finest, where a well-timed feast could be as effective as a well-aimed spear. Reflecting on the day's experiences, you realize how the Viking lifestyle is a stark contrast to the Hollywood myth. The romance of bold warriors and endless feasts is tempered by the harsh realities of survival in a world where resources were as scarce as a warm winter day. The Vikings were not just fearsome raiders. They were masterful traders, shrewd politicians, and resourceful survivors. They navigated the complexities of their world with a blend of brawn and brains, leaving behind a legacy far richer than the simple stories of conquest. In the flickering firelight, as the longhouse resonates with the chorus of voices sharing stories, you see the true heart of the Viking world. A community bound by shared hardship and triumph, where every feast, every tale, every moment is a thread in the grand tapestry of their history. This world, so often painted in broad strokes of violence and adventure, reveals itself to be as intricate and nuanced as the patterns on a Viking shield. So as you settle in for the night, full from the hearty stew, and perhaps a bit tipsy from the mead, take a moment to appreciate the complexity of the Viking legacy. They were not just the brutal marauders of legend, but a people who understood the delicate balance of power, community, and survival. Their stories, like the runes they carved, leave an indelible mark on history, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. And there you have it, the real Viking experience, part myth, part reality, but always fascinating. As the last embers of the communal hearth glow softly, it's clear that the Vikings were more than just warriors. They were a society of traders, farmers, and storytellers who navigated the challenges of their world with a blend of tradition and innovation. They were as much about the subtle art of diplomacy as the clash of swords. And as you drift off to sleep in your Viking longhouse, you might just find yourself dreaming of the sagas yet to be told, the stories waiting to be uncovered in the rich tapestry of history. A lanky kid born in a Kentucky log cabin on February 12, 1809, might not sound like the makings of a future president, but Abraham Lincoln was never interested in blending in. He stood out even in a crowd of pioneers, not least because he shot up to a towering 6 feet 4 inches tall, practically a skyscraper in an era when the average man was closer to 5 feet 8 inches. But let's rewind to that humble cabin, which in truth was about as cozy as a shoebox. Lincoln's early life was a series of moves, mostly in search of better prospects, which usually meant more fertile soil or at least neighbors who weren't quite so trigger-happy. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a man of the earth, literally. He farmed it, built with it, and no doubt cursed it when it didn't yield enough to feed the family. They moved to Indiana when Abe was just 7, and with this relocation came a change in fortunes. And by change in fortunes, I mean they were still dirt poor, just on different dirt. Here, young Abe got his first taste of the frontier life, which involved a lot of manual labor and not much schooling. In fact, Lincoln's formal education added up to less than a year's worth of classes. But what he lacked in classroom time, he made up for with an unrelenting curiosity. This was a kid who borrowed books from neighbors like some people borrow sugar, devouring everything from the Bible to Shakespeare. Now, Here's where the myth-making machine goes into overdrive, the rail splitter legend. Sure, Lincoln did split some rails. It was an honest day's work, and it helped put food on the table. But the image of him as a backwards Hercules, single-handedly taming the wilderness with his trusty axe, is a bit much. The truth is, he was more likely dreaming about Cicero or Euclid while he swung that axe, ready to trade the tool for a book at any chance he got. Fast forward to his early 20s, and Lincoln found himself in New Salem, Illinois, a small village where he wore a dizzying number of hats. Store clerk, postmaster, and even a surveyor, all jobs that paid the bills while he continued to self-educate. The man literally read law by candlelight, a detail both romantic and a bit tragic, considering those candles probably cost more than he made in a week. In 1836, after teaching himself enough law to pass the bar exam, he embarked on what would become a distinguished legal career. But let's pause to appreciate the sheer tenacity here. This was a guy who hauled himself up by his bootstraps, or rather, his lack of boots, given his impoverished beginnings. He rode the circuit, which sounds like a quaint way to see the countryside, but in reality it was grueling work. Lawyers like Lincoln traveled hundreds of miles on horseback, from one small town to another, trying cases in makeshift courtrooms. Not exactly the glamorous life of a big city lawyer, but it was this kind of experience that honed Lincoln's skills in rhetoric and logic, not to mention his knack for storytelling. Speaking of storytelling, let's talk about Lincoln's foray into politics and those early campaign speeches. If you think you've seen awkward political moments, you ain't seen nothing. Lincoln's first run for the Illinois General Assembly in 1832 was less a slam dunk and more of a face plant. He lost, but not without gaining a reputation for being a bit of a character. During one speech, he was reportedly so distracted by a rowdy bunch of hecklers that he forgot his points, leaving his audience more entertained than persuaded. But Lincoln took it in stride, using self-deprecating humor as his shield. His second attempt at a political career was more successful, and he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1834. Here, Lincoln began to shape his identity as a Whig, a party that valued modernization and economic growth. This was a period of rapid change in America. Railroads were the new arteries of commerce, and cities were swelling with immigrants and opportunity. Lincoln was fascinated by this progress, and he wanted in on the action. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before he could reshape the nation, he had to maneuver through the tangled web of local politics, where deals were struck in dimly lit taverns rather than grand halls. It was a political scene ripe with intrigue and rivalry, and Lincoln navigated it with a mix of ambition and humility. In these early years, Lincoln also honed his skills in oratory, though calling him a natural would be a stretch. His high-pitched voice and gawky appearance were the stuff of caricature, and he often joked about his own looks, a tactic that somewhat disarmed his critics. Despite these challenges, he developed a powerful, logical style of speaking that was as persuasive as it was plain-spoken. Even then, folks couldn't help but notice that this lawyer from Illinois had something special, a spark that would eventually ignite a nation. So there you have it, the young Lincoln, equal parts myth and man, setting the stage for what would become one of the most pivotal political careers in American history. It's a story that begins not with destiny, but with a lot of hard work, self-doubt, and a fair bit of humor along the way. Stay tuned, because things are just getting started. As Lincoln's political career gathered momentum, he found himself knee-deep in the Illinois state legislature, a place where ambition was as common as bad coffee. Picture the young Lincoln, a freshly minted lawyer, sitting in those wooden chambers in Springfield, Illinois, surrounded by men in frock coats and top hats who were as eager to make their mark as he was. Sure, the setting might sound quaint now, but back then it was the epicenter of political drama. The Illinois state legislature was a crucible for Lincoln, a place where his ideas about modernization and economic growth were put to the test. Lincoln wasn't just about words. He was about action, pushing for internal improvements like railroads and canals. He believed they were the arteries that would pump lifeblood into America's burgeoning economy. And let's not forget, this was a time when a railroad boom was as exciting as today's tech startups. But hold your horses. Lincoln's political journey wasn't all smooth sailing. It was more like a rickety wagon ride over a pothole-laden dirt road. The early 1840s saw Lincoln striving to strike a balance between his legal career and his political ambitions. He served 4 terms in the Illinois House of Representatives, where he honed his skills in persuasion and negotiation. But here's the kicker. Despite his efforts, the Whig Party with which Lincoln was affiliated was often overshadowed by the Democrats in Illinois. It was the political equivalent of being the underdog in a David versus Goliath match, and Lincoln had to learn to box clever. Speaking of battles, let's flash forward to Lincoln's failed bid for the U.S. Senate in 1858 against the formidable Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was no pushover. He was a heavyweight in politics, known as the Little Giant for his short stature and towering influence. The contest between them was like a gladiatorial match fought with words instead of swords. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were the centerpiece of this campaign, a series of 7 debates held across Illinois that drew crowds like a 19th-century rock concert. Tens of thousands of people gathered, hungry for political theater, and they got more than their money's worth. Lincoln, with his gangly frame and distinctive voice, was a master of wit and logic. He challenged Douglas on the issue of slavery, a topic hotter than a midsummer day in Illinois. During these debates, Lincoln deftly skewered Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty, the idea that states should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not be expanded. His famous line, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," encapsulated his belief that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. Yet let's not mythologize Lincoln as an overnight sensation. He didn't stride onto the stage and instantly captivate the nation. The truth is, he lost that Senate race. But here's the twist. His loss was a strategic win. The debates thrust him into the national spotlight, and people started to notice this tall, folksy lawyer with an uncanny ability to turn a phrase. It was like he was auditioning for a role that didn't quite exist yet, and while he didn't land the Senate seat, he did secure a place in the national consciousness. Lincoln's rise to national prominence was anything but linear. It was more like a roller coaster with unexpected twists and turns. After his Senate loss, he returned to his law practice, but his star was on the rise, and the Republican Party was taking notice. The Republicans were the new kids on the block, a party born from the anti-slavery movement. They needed a candidate who could unite the factions and take on the Democrats in the upcoming presidential election. Enter Abraham Lincoln, the dark horse candidate with a knack for storytelling and a vision for the future. By 1860, Lincoln had become a household name, thanks in large part to the publication of the debates. His speeches were printed in newspapers across the country, his words reaching far beyond the prairies of Illinois. The political landscape was ripe for change, and Lincoln's message resonated with a nation on the brink of division. It was a time of economic upheaval and social unrest, and Lincoln's call for unity and moral clarity struck a chord. Lincoln's nomination for the presidency was no small feat. It took a savvy campaign and some good old-fashioned politicking at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. Lincoln wasn't the frontrunner, far from it. He faced stiff competition from more established figures like William Seward and Salmon Chase. But his team worked the convention floor like seasoned chess players, building alliances and securing votes. When the dust settled, Lincoln emerged as the Republican nominee, a testament to his ability to inspire and unite diverse factions. The 1860 presidential campaign was a whirlwind of speeches, rallies, and newspaper editorials. Lincoln crisscrossed the country, delivering speeches that combined humor with a poignant call for national unity. His message was clear. The nation could not continue on its current path of division. He framed the contest as a battle for the soul of America, setting the stage for one of the most consequential elections in the country's history. As Lincoln headed into the election, he was up against 3 other candidates, Stephen Douglas, John Bell, and John Breckinridge. The race was as crowded as a saloon on a Saturday night, and each candidate represented a different vision for America's future. But Lincoln's message of unity and moral clarity resonated with voters, especially in the North. When the votes were counted, Lincoln won with 180 electoral votes, capturing 8% of the popular vote. His victory was a seismic shift in American politics, a clear signal that the nation was ready for change. But let's not sugarcoat it. Lincoln's road to the presidency was paved with challenges. His ascent was not the result of destiny or divine intervention. It was a product of tenacity, strategic thinking, and an unwavering belief in the power of words to change hearts and minds. As the nation teetered on the brink of civil war, Lincoln's election was both a triumph and a precursor to the immense challenges that lay ahead. The stage was set for one of the most tumultuous chapters in American history, with Lincoln at the helm, steering the ship through stormy seas. Stay tuned, because Lincoln's journey is far from over, and the story of how he navigated the turbulent waters of leadership is one for the ages. As Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, there was no escaping the looming storm clouds of civil war. The nation felt like a tinderbox, and Lincoln had just been handed the matchbook. But if anyone thought he'd be fazed, they didn't know Honest Abe. He was stepping into the role of a lifetime, not as a savior with divine insight, but as a pragmatic leader ready to tackle the mess head-on. The Union was on the verge of collapse, with southern states seceding faster than you can say Fort Sumter, where the first shots of the Civil War would soon be fired. Lincoln's job: keep the Union together, no matter the cost. Right off the bat, Lincoln faced the harsh reality of leadership. Everyone wants something, and nobody agrees on anything. The White House quickly became a hotspot for conflicting egos, with Lincoln's cabinet more like a collection of frenemies than a team. You had Secretary of State William Seward, who fancied himself the brains behind the operation, and Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, who was angling for Lincoln's job even as he served under him. In some ways, Lincoln had to be more of a juggler than a president, balancing personalities while trying to keep the country from falling apart. The Civil War was a logistical nightmare, a chess game played with real lives and real consequences. It was Lincoln's task to strategize and adapt, even as the ground shifted beneath him. The Union Army wasn't exactly a well-oiled machine at the start. It was more like a rusty, creaking contraption held together by baling wire and hope. General George McClellan, Lincoln's first major military appointment, was a brilliant organizer, but about as quick to action as molasses in January. Lincoln needed wins, and he needed them fast, but McClellan seemed more interested in perfecting parade formations than engaging in battle. Lincoln's patience with McClellan eventually wore thin, and the president was forced to play musical chairs with his generals until he found a combination that worked. Enter Ulysses S. Grant, who, unlike his predecessors, understood the brutal arithmetic of war. Grant's aggressive tactics helped turn the tide for the Union, but not without a steep cost in human life, a reality Lincoln grappled with daily. The Battle of Antietam in 1862, for instance, was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, with over 22,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. It was a grim reminder that victory would not come cheap. Amidst the bloody chaos, Lincoln knew he needed a game-changer, a bold move to redefine the war's purpose. Enter the Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863. Now, let's clear up the common misconception that this document instantly freed all slaves in America. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The proclamation declared freedom for slaves in Confederate states, where Lincoln's authority was about as effective as a chocolate teapot, given those states were in open rebellion. But it was a strategic masterstroke, shifting the war's focus to a moral crusade against slavery and preventing European powers from siding with the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation also paved the way for the enlistment of African-American soldiers into the Union Army, adding around 180,000 troops to the cause. This wasn't just a noble gesture, it was a pragmatic one. The Union needed manpower, and African Americans, eager to fight for their freedom, answered the call. Their contributions were invaluable, yet the reality was they faced discrimination even as they fought for a country that had long denied them basic rights. While the Emancipation Proclamation is often hailed as a beacon of freedom, it's important to remember that Lincoln's primary goal was preserving the Union. Slavery's abolition, while deeply personal for Lincoln, was also a tool to achieve that end. His famous line, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it," underscores Lincoln's pragmatism. He was a man of ideals, yes, but also one acutely aware of political realities. As the war dragged on, Lincoln faced mounting pressure from all sides. The Union's fortunes ebbed and flowed, and public opinion was as fickle as the weather. The 1863 New York City draft riots, sparked by anger over the draft law and racial tensions, were a sobering reminder of the home front's volatility. For 4 days, the city descended into chaos, and it took federal troops to restore order, a stark illustration of the domestic challenges Lincoln had to juggle alongside the war. By 1864, Lincoln found himself in the political fight of his life, running for re-election against his former general, George McClellan. The country was weary of war, and many doubted Lincoln's ability to end it. The election was a referendum on Lincoln's leadership and the war's direction. For a time, it seemed Lincoln's political career might meet an untimely end, with McClellan's platform promising a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. But just when things looked bleak, General William Tecumseh Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 gave Lincoln the boost he needed. It was a turning point, both militarily and politically, and Lincoln rode that wave of momentum to victory in November. He won 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21, securing his second term in office. It was a vindication of his leadership and a mandate to continue the fight. Lincoln's re-election was more than a personal triumph. It was a message to the Confederacy that the Union was in it for the long haul. The war dragged on into 1865, with the Confederacy's resources dwindling and its armies crumbling. Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, began to look toward reconciliation and rebuilding. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, struck a tone of healing and unity. With malice toward none, with charity for all, Lincoln envisioned a nation reunited, though the path to that future was still fraught with challenges. As the war neared its conclusion, Lincoln's focus shifted to the post-war landscape. He was acutely aware that the Union's victory would be hollow without addressing the root causes of the conflict. The passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was a crucial step in this direction. But Lincoln knew that the work of Reconstruction would require more than legal changes. It would demand a fundamental reshaping of American society. Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War was a masterclass in balancing idealism with pragmatism. He navigated through a sea of adversity with humor, humility, and an unyielding commitment to preserving the Union. His presidency was not without its missteps and controversies, but his ability to adapt and persevere through the darkest days of the nation's history cemented his legacy as one of America's greatest leaders. As the guns fell silent and the nation began to heal, Lincoln's vision for America was one of hope and renewal. Yet, his story does not conclude here. The final chapter of his life would be written in the days following the war, and it would take an unexpected and tragic turn, leaving a legacy that would resonate through the ages. But that's a tale for another day, as we continue to unravel the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, a man who, against all odds, steered a divided nation through its darkest hours. As the war's final echoes faded, and the nation began to contemplate its future, Lincoln had his eye firmly fixed on a different battleground, the United States Congress. It was the beginning of 1865, and Lincoln was determined to see the 13th Amendment passed, a constitutional change that would abolish slavery across the entire nation. Now here's where the myth and the reality start to wrestle each other like a pair of stubborn mules. The popular image of Lincoln as a lone crusader for freedom is inspiring, sure, but it's a bit like believing a single man can push a boulder uphill without a team of oxen. The truth, it took a political acrobatics routine that would make the greatest circus performer blush. First, let's set the scene. The 13th Amendment had already passed the Senate in April 1864, but it was stuck in the House like a rusty nail. Lincoln needed a 2/3 majority, and he was about as close to that as a cat is to voluntarily taking a bath. The Democrats, who controlled enough votes to block it, were less than thrilled about the idea of abolishing slavery. So, what did Lincoln do? He rolled up his sleeves and prepared to engage in what can only be described as some serious political horse trading. Think of it as a high-stakes poker game where Lincoln had to bluff, cajole, and charm his way to victory. Understand this. Lincoln was no stranger to the backroom deals and compromises that defined 19th century politics. He wasn't a saintly figure operating above the fray. He was a masterful tactician who understood the art of persuasion. Take, for instance, his use of patronage, the practice of doling out government jobs to win support. Lincoln wielded this tool like a seasoned blacksmith, offering cushy federal appointments to wavering Democrats if they backed the amendment. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Some might call it bribery. Lincoln called it necessary. Of course, Lincoln didn't just rely on political maneuvering. The man was a raconteur of the highest order, and he used his storytelling as a strategic weapon. There's a famous anecdote about Lincoln quelling a tense meeting with a story about Ethan Allen, a Revolutionary War hero. According to Lincoln, Allen once visited England, where the British, eager to needle him, hung a portrait of George Washington in the outhouse. When Allen emerged unfazed, the Brits asked why he wasn't bothered. Allen quipped that nothing made an Englishman shit quicker than the sight of George Washington. The room erupted in laughter, the tension dissolved, and Lincoln had once again turned the tide with his humor. But let's not mistake humor for softness. Lincoln had a spine of steel when it came to his convictions. He believed passionately in the moral imperative to end slavery, a conviction that often conflicted with the political realities of the day. He once said, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Yet, he knew that moral arguments alone wouldn't sway the necessary votes. So Lincoln made it personal, appealing to the hearts and minds of individual legislators, often reminding them that history would judge their actions. Then there was the economic angle. The Civil War had already decimated the Southern economy, and the prospect of a post-war South without slavery was daunting to many. Lincoln needed to convince skeptics that the Union's economic future depended on abolition. He argued that a free labor system would lead to prosperity and innovation, pointing out that the North's bustling economy was no accident. For Lincoln, the war against slavery was not just a moral crusade. It was an economic imperative. The stakes were high, and the vote was set for January 31, 1865. As the day approached, the political atmosphere in Washington was electric, with both sides pulling out all the stops. When the House finally convened to vote, the galleries were packed, so crowded, in fact, that some attendees were forced to stand in the aisles. It was a scene reminiscent of a high-stakes courtroom drama, with every eye on the roll call as it began. And as the final votes were tallied, the amendment passed by a narrow margin, 119 to 56, just enough to meet the 2/3 requirement. The chamber erupted into cheers, with some members even breaking into the battle cry of freedom. Lincoln's victory was a testament to his political skill and determination, but it was not merely his triumph. It was the culmination of years of effort by countless abolitionists and activists who had fought tirelessly for the cause. Lincoln himself acknowledged this, understanding that while he was the face of the movement, the heart of it belonged to the people. He saw the passage of the 13th Amendment not just as a legislative victory, but as a moral one, a critical step in healing a divided nation. Yet the work was far from over. With the amendment on its way to ratification by the states, Lincoln turned his focus to Reconstruction. the daunting task of rebuilding the South and integrating millions of freed slaves into American society. It was a challenge that required not just policies, but compassion and foresight. Lincoln envisioned a post-war America where former Confederates and freedmen could coexist peacefully, but he knew this dream would take time and patience to realize. Lincoln's role in passing the 13th Amendment illustrates the blend of idealism and pragmatism that characterized his presidency. He was a leader who understood the power of words, the necessity of compromise, and the importance of vision. He managed to navigate the murky waters of politics with a rare combination of humor, humility, and tenacity. And while the fight for equality was far from over, Lincoln's efforts laid the groundwork for the civil rights advancements that would follow. So there you have it, the gritty, unvarnished truth of Lincoln's political gymnastics to secure the passage of the 13th Amendment. It wasn't a one-man show, nor was it a purely noble crusade. It was a complex, multifaceted effort that required every ounce of Lincoln's cunning and charisma. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, it's important to remember both the romance and the reality, the legend and the labor. Because if Lincoln's story teaches us anything, it's that progress is rarely straightforward, and the path to change is often paved with compromise and courage. Stay tuned, because the story doesn't end here, and Lincoln's journey, and ours, is far from finished. So, with the ink barely dry on the 13th Amendment, Lincoln was already dreaming of a united America, a nation ready to heal, not just from the wounds of war, but from the scars of slavery. But fate, as they say, had other plans. Enter stage left the infamous night of April 14, 1865, when Lincoln, seeking a brief respite from the stress of leadership, attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Spoiler alert. This wasn't destined to be a relaxing evening out. Now, John Wilkes Booth, the actor-turned-assassin, entered the scene with a delusional sense of heroism. You see, Booth fancied himself a latter-day Brutus, avenging the South by striking down the tyrant Lincoln. It's a tragic irony of history that Booth's misguided attempt to save the South only hastened its downfall. When Booth pulled the trigger and sent a single shot into Lincoln's skull, the reverberations were felt nationwide, as if the very soul of America had been wounded. Lincoln's assassination sent shockwaves through the nation, plunging it into deep mourning. The immediate aftermath was chaos, emotionally and politically. Vice President Andrew Johnson, thrust into the presidency, was about as prepared as a cat at a dog show. His approach to Reconstruction was a stark departure from Lincoln's more conciliatory vision, leading to tensions that would shape the nation for decades. But back to Lincoln's funeral, a spectacle that matched the gravity of his life and death. His body embarked on a 1,654-mile journey by train, passing through 180 cities and 7 states, allowing ravaged citizens to pay their respects. It was a national outpouring of grief, a reminder of the profound impact Lincoln had on the American psyche. And here, where the myth-making machine kicked into overdrive. In death, Lincoln was elevated to near sainthood. He became the great emancipator, the man who saved the Union, a political messiah cut down in his prime. But let's pump the brakes on canonization for a second. Lincoln was, after all, a politician, pragmatic, sometimes calculating, and certainly not infallible. His views on race and equality were progressive for his time, yet by modern standards, they might seem, well, less than ideal. He once remarked that he had no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. Not exactly the words of a flawless hero. The romanticized image of Lincoln as an unblemished icon is a bit like trying to sell a used car without mentioning its faulty transmission. The reality is far more complex. Lincoln was a man of contradictions, deeply empathetic yet politically shrewd, morally driven yet occasionally compromising. His legacy is a tapestry of achievements and shortcomings, woven together by the threads of his humanity. As the years rolled on, Lincoln's image continued to evolve, shaped by the lens of history and the needs of each generation. During the Civil Rights Movement, He was hailed as a symbol of justice and equality, his words inspiring a new generation of activists. Yet his pragmatic approach to politics and his initial reluctance to make abolition the central war aim reveal a man who made decisions based on the turbulent realities of his time, not just lofty ideals. Let's not forget the economic and social context that framed his presidency. The Civil War was as much about economic tensions and states' rights as it was about slavery. The North's industrial economy clashed with the agrarian South, and Lincoln's vision of a united, modern America was intrinsically tied to economic progress. The railroads, canals, and telegraphs he championed laid the groundwork for the nation's transformation into an industrial powerhouse. Fast forward to today, and Lincoln's legacy is a complex mosaic of reverence and reality. He's the face on the penny, the subject of countless books, and the towering figure in the Lincoln Memorial. Yet behind the marble facade lies a story of resilience and imperfection, a reminder that history's heroes are not born but made, shaped by their times and choices. So, what's the takeaway here? Perhaps it's the realization that history is not a neat narrative with clear-cut heroes and villains. It's a messy, intricate dance of people, politics, and power. Lincoln's story is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that greatness is not the absence of flaws, but the courage to rise above them. It's a legacy that continues to resonate, challenging us to look beyond the myths and confront the complex truths that define our past and shape our future. In the end, Lincoln's legacy is not just about what he achieved, but how he navigated the turbulent waters of his era with humor, humility, and an unyielding belief in the promise of a united America. His life was a symphony of contradictions, a reminder that history, like humanity, is beautifully imperfect. And as we close this chapter on Lincoln, let's carry forward the lessons of his journey, a journey marked by struggle, hope, and the relentless pursuit of a more perfect union. Corsica in the late 18th century was like the unruly little sibling of Europe, fiercely independent and just a tad rebellious. It's here, on this rugged island, that Napoleon Bonaparte first made his grand entrance into the world on August 15, 1769. Now, you might think that Napoleon was born with a tiny tricorn hat on his head and a miniature sword in his hand, but the reality was a bit less epic. He was born into a family of minor nobility, which, let's face it, is really just a fancy way of saying they weren't exactly rolling in dough. Napoleon's father, Carlo Buonaparte, was a lawyer with political ambitions, and his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was known for her strength and resilience, a trait Napoleon seemed to have inherited. At the time of Napoleon's birth, Corsica had just been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa. This transaction wasn't exactly a blockbuster hit with the local Corsican population, who were not thrilled about swapping one foreign ruler for another. So young Napoleon grew up in a land simmering with discontent, a perfect place to brew a future conqueror. Napoleon's early years were marked by the kind of adventures you'd expect from a kid growing up on an island. He probably ran around barefoot, climbed the rocky hills, and engaged in the typical mischief that would make any parent's hair turn grey. But even as a child, he was the embodiment of intensity. There's a story about him refusing to play with other children unless they agreed to play war games, with young Napoleon, of course, as the commander. Talk about setting the stage early. By the age of 9, Napoleon's life took a dramatic turn. Thanks to his father's connections and a hefty dose of ambition, he was shipped off to mainland France to get a proper education. Now, let's put this into perspective. Leaving the sun-soaked island life of Corsica for the cold, structured halls of Brienne-le-Château military school in France was like swapping a tropical beach for a strict boarding school. Not exactly the upgrade a young boy dreams about. Arriving in France, Napoleon was immediately pegged as an outsider. His thick Corsican accent and lack of French fluency made him a prime target for the schoolyard version of Who's the Odd Kid Out. Yet, instead of being discouraged, Napoleon doubled down. He poured his energy into his studies, particularly excelling in mathematics and history, because, of course, Every aspiring conqueror needs to know their numbers and past wars. Napoleon's time at Brienne was anything but glamorous. He was often ridiculed for his accent and his diminutive stature, a fact of life that would stick with him throughout his career. But here's the kicker. While the legends exaggerate his height issues, the truth is he stood about 56, which was pretty average for the time. Nonetheless, it was his ambition that was truly towering. He once wrote in a school essay that great ambition is the passion of a great character. And boy, did he live up to that mantra. After Brienne, Napoleon's relentless drive landed him at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris in 1784. He was just 15 years old, and he wasn't exactly arriving with a hero's welcome. In fact, he was only admitted a year earlier than usual because his father had passed away, and the family needed a breadwinner. Let's pause here for a moment. A 15-year-old as the family's main hope for a stable income. Talk about pressure, right? At the École Militaire, Napoleon's awkward teenage years were filled with an odd mix of brilliance and bumbling. He completed the 2-year program in just 1 year, which was impressive, but his social skills, not so much. He was a loner, often spending his free time reading about Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great rather than socializing with his peers. It's like he was writing the playbook for future introverted geniuses everywhere. Graduating from the École Militaire in 1785, Napoleon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. At just 16, he was thrown into the mix of the French military machine. Now, this is where things start getting juicy, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in Corsica, his family was still navigating the island's turbulent politics. The Bonaparte clan was deeply involved in the Corsican independence movement, and the island itself was a cauldron of political intrigue and skirmishes. The romantic notion of Napoleon as a Corsican patriot is often overblown. Sure, he had a youthful fling with the idea of Corsican independence, but as with many teenagers, his passions were fluid. When push came to shove, Napoleon saw the writing on the wall. His future lay with France, not the embattled Corsican cause. His family's political connections in Corsica, however, were not without consequence. There's a tale of a young Napoleon attempting to lead a Corsican militia during a local conflict, only to be soundly outmaneuvered by his political rivals. It seems even the future emperor had to start somewhere. Napoleon's blend of Corsican grit and French finesse set the stage for his meteoric rise. But at this point, he was just a young officer, trying to find his way in a world that was changing faster than a French weather forecast. The French Revolution was right around the corner, and Napoleon was about to ride that wave like a pro surfer catching the perfect swell. As we wrap up this chapter of Napoleon's early life, it's worth noting how his origins shaped him. His Corsican roots gave him a fierce independence and a chip on his shoulder, while his French education provided the tools he needed to climb the military ranks. And despite the myth of Napoleon, the all-conquering hero, the reality was that he started off as a scrappy outsider with something to prove. Keep that in mind as we dive deeper into the saga of the Corsican who would one day rule Europe. Napoleon stood at the precipice of destiny, a scrappy young officer with ambitions as grand as any epic poem, yet his feet firmly planted in the gritty reality of revolutionary France. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted like a powder keg, and if the world had a how-to guide for chaos, France was writing it in real time. The country was a hot mess of political upheaval, economic meltdown, and social unrest. The monarchy was teetering, the guillotine was warming up for its debut, and the streets of Paris were alive with the sound of barricades being built and torn down. Amid all this, Napoleon was about to find his calling. Now, let's cut to the siege of Toulon in 1793, where our young artillery officer got his first real taste of glory. Toulon was a key naval port that had thrown its lot in with the royalists, essentially giving the revolutionary government the proverbial middle finger. The British, ever the opportunists, saw this as a chance to stick it to the French and promptly sent their fleet to support the royalists. Enter Napoleon, who wasn't exactly invited to the party, but made his presence known nonetheless. His audacity and tactical brilliance shone through when he proposed a daring plan to capture the forts controlling the harbour. And here's the kicker: the plan worked. By December, French forces recaptured Toulon, and Napoleon, the upstart, was promoted to brigadier general at age 24. Not bad for a guy who was still learning the ropes. But let's not get too carried away with the Napoleon as a military genius narrative just yet. Sure, his success at Toulon was impressive, but it was as much about timing and luck as it was about strategy. The chaos of the revolution meant that the military was desperate for capable leaders, and Napoleon happened to be in the right place at the right time. And let's be honest, the French army wasn't exactly flush with seasoned commanders. Most of them had either fled or lost their heads, literally, during the revolution's purges. Speaking of purges, the Reign of Terror was in full swing, and Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety was as warm and fuzzy as a pit of vipers. But Napoleon, ever the political chameleon, managed to keep his head down and his ambition up. The economic situation was dire, with the French economy suffering from hyperinflation and resource shortages. Bread riots were as common as baguettes, and the government was about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. Yet, in this environment, Napoleon thrived. Fast forward to 1796, and Napoleon was handed command of the French army of Italy. Now, this wasn't exactly a plum assignment, more like a poisoned chalice. The army was poorly equipped, barely paid, and demoralized, but Napoleon saw it as his chance to shine. He whipped his ragtag troops into shape with a mix of charisma and sheer force of will. His Italian campaign was a masterclass in audacity, speed, and strategy. Over the course of a year, he won a series of stunning victories against the Austrians and their allies, culminating in the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. But hey, before we start singing Napoleon's praises like a choir of sycophants, let's dig a little deeper. His Italian campaign was as much about exploiting division and confusion among his enemies as it was about sheer brilliance. He was a maestro of propaganda, painting himself as the liberator of Italy while squeezing it dry of resources to support his army. The truth was, Napoleon understood the power of image and narrative. He wasn't just fighting battles. He was crafting legends. And speaking of legends, let's talk about his early missteps. Like any great story, Napoleon's rise wasn't without its plot twists and pratfalls. One of his early blunders came during a disastrous attempt to capture Corsica in 1793, which ended with a hasty retreat and his family fleeing to the mainland. Then there was the time he was briefly put under house arrest due to his association with the wrong political faction during the Thermidorian reaction in 1794. It was a reminder that in revolutionary France, the political winds could change faster than a Parisian insult. But each misstep was a lesson, a stepping stone on his path to power. Napoleon's genius wasn't just in his ability to win battles, but in his knack for learning from his mistakes and adapting to changing circumstances. It was this quality that allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of revolutionary politics and emerge on the other side, not just unscathed, but triumphant. In the end, Napoleon's early military career was a blend of brilliance, bluster, and a dash of good fortune. His rise during the French Revolution was meteoric, fueled by a combination of talent, timing, and the sheer unpredictability of the era. The myth of Napoleon as a military genius was already in the making. But beneath the legend was a man who understood that in a world of chaos, the bold and the daring could write their own destiny. And that's exactly what he intended to do, one battle at a time. As Napoleon's career was hitting its stride, the man was far from content with just dazzling military feats. After all, what good is a string of victories without a crown to wear? Fast forward to the year 1799, and France was a political soap opera with plot twists that could rival any modern-day thriller. The French Directory, the ruling government, was about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Corruption was rampant, the economy was a mess, and the people were about as restless as cats in a room full of rocking chairs. Enter Napoleon, stage right, with dreams of grandeur and a knack for seizing opportunities. By 1799, Napoleon was back from his Egyptian escapades, where he'd managed to conquer the pyramids but failed to conquer the British at sea. The French public, however, was blissfully unaware of his Nile-sized blunders, thanks to Napoleon's mastery of self-promotion. He spun tales of triumphs and conveniently glossed over the defeats, proving once again that the first rule of being a hero is controlling the narrative. So, when he returned to France, he was greeted not as a disgraced general, but as a returning hero. Sensing the vulnerability of the Directory and the rising tide of public dissatisfaction, Napoleon saw his moment to strike. On November 9, 1799, he orchestrated a coup d'etat, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. In a move worthy of any political mastermind, he leveraged his popularity, military clout, and a bit of family drama. His brother Lucien was president of the Council of 500 to dismantle the government. It's worth noting here that Napoleon wasn't exactly storming the Bastille with pitchforks. No, this was a carefully choreographed piece of political theatre. With a little arm-twisting and a lot of charisma, Napoleon was soon appointed first consul, effectively making him the de facto ruler of France. Talk about a glow-up. But let's not kid ourselves. Napoleon wasn't just about fancy titles and power grabs. He knew that to keep control, he needed more than just military victories and political maneuvers. He needed reforms that would solidify his rule and win over the hearts and minds of the French people. Enter the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that would become one of his most enduring legacies. Introduced in 1804, this set of civil laws was a game-changer, streamlining the chaotic legal system into something resembling order and justice, or at least Napoleon's version of it. The Napoleonic Code was a mixed bag of progress and authoritarian control. On one hand, it abolished feudal privileges, reaffirmed the principles of property rights, and laid down the foundation for modern legal systems across Europe. Women, however, got the short end of the stick. The code reinforced patriarchal norms, treating women more like property than individuals with their own rights. So much for liberté, égalité, fraternité, Napoleon, ever the pragmatic ruler, was more interested in stability and control than in ensuring gender equality. But his domestic achievements weren't just limited to legal reforms. Napoleon had an uncanny ability to juggle the carrot and the stick. He reformed the education system, established the Bank of France in 1800, and introduced a stable currency, the franc, which helped stabilize the economy that had been floundering like a fish out of water. Yet, while he was busy laying the foundations for a modern state, he was also tightening his grip on the reins of power, censoring the press, and establishing a network of spies that would make George Orwell's Big Brother proud. Napoleon's propaganda machine was a masterpiece of spin and spectacle. Forget fake news. Napoleon was all about crafting a heroic narrative where he was the star. He commissioned grandiose paintings depicting his victories, even if they were more fiction than fact. He understood that in the court of public opinion, image was everything. In one memorable piece, Napoleon is shown crossing the Alps on a rearing stallion, a majestic scene that conveniently omits the fact that he actually made the journey on a much less glamorous mule. It's the historical equivalent of an Instagram filter, tweaking reality to fit the narrative. As Napoleon consolidated his power, he mastered the art of balancing authoritarian control with just enough reform to keep the populace from revolting. He was a maestro of political machinations, deftly navigating the complex landscape of French politics with a mix of charm, coercion, and a healthy dose of strategic alliances. Yet beneath the veneer of progress lay the iron fist of oppression. Political dissent was not tolerated, and critics often found themselves on the wrong side of a prison cell or a guillotine. Napoleon's reign was a constant tightrope walk between enlightened ruler and ruthless dictator. His ability to maintain public support was nothing short of Machiavellian. By presenting himself as the savior of France, Both militarily and economically, he kept the populace on his side, even as he centralized power and curtailed liberties. His ultimate goal was clear: a return to monarchy, but with himself as emperor. And in 1804, he made that leap, crowning himself Emperor of the French in a ceremony that was as much about pageantry as it was about power. Napoleon's rise from provincial outsider to Emperor of the French was a testament to his unmatched ambition and political acumen. He played the game like a grand chess master, always 3 moves ahead of his opponents. But as he stood atop the new French Empire, the question loomed: how long could he keep all these plates spinning? The seeds of his eventual downfall were already being sown, and the world was about to find out that what goes up must eventually come down. But for now, in the early 1800s, Napoleon was riding high, the master of his own destiny, and the architect of an empire that stretched far beyond the borders of France. Napoleon, teetering on the peak of his power, was just about ready to rewrite the European map with a swagger that only a freshly crowned emperor could muster. Enter the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, a clash so iconic that it practically screams Napoleon's greatest hits. This wasn't just another scuffle on the battlefield. It was his masterpiece, his Mona Lisa of military genius. Napoleon faced off against the Third Coalition, a lineup of heavyweights including Austria and Russia, who weren't exactly his biggest fans. They probably had "kick Napoleon's butt" on their New Year's resolution list. Now that's where Napoleon showed his flair for the dramatic. Outnumbered, with around 68,000 troops against the coalition's 85,000, he pulled a move that would have made Sun Tzu nod in approval. He deliberately weakened his right flank, luring his enemies into a trap tighter than a drum. When the coalition took the bait, Napoleon struck like a cobbler's hammer, splitting their forces and delivering a decisive blow. The battle was over in just 9 hours, a whirlwind of chaos that left the coalition licking their wounds and Napoleon basking in the glow of victory. But let's not get too caught up in the romance of the story. Austerlitz, while a feather in Napoleon's bicorn hat, wasn't just about cunning strategy. It also showcased the brutal efficiency of his military machine. His Grand Armée was a logistical marvel, with a supply line that kept his troops fed, armed, and ready to march at a moment's notice. Napoleon, you see, was a master of logistics. He knew that an army marches on its stomach, and he made sure his soldiers had plenty of bread and bullets, even if it meant requisitioning, or, let's be real, plundering, supplies from local populations. The economic cost of such brilliance was staggering. Funding an army of over 600,000 troops wasn't exactly cheap. France's economy was stretched thinner than a crepe, with war taxes that would make today's IRS blush. The French treasury was perpetually on the brink of collapse, a precarious balancing act that Napoleon managed with the finesse of a circus performer juggling flaming torches. As the dust settled on Austerlitz, Napoleon's ego, already sizable, now required its own postcode. But that's where things take a turn from conqueror's fairy tale to what was he thinking? The ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812. Picture this: Napoleon, convinced of his invincibility, decides to tackle Russia, because clearly a country that spans 11 time zones is just asking to be conquered. With an army of about 685,000 men, dubbed the Grand Armée, Napoleon embarked on what would become one of history's greatest military blunders. The plan was to strike quickly, force a decisive battle, and dictate peace terms in Moscow. But the Russians employed a scorched earth policy, retreating deeper into their vast homeland and ensuring that Napoleon's army would find nothing but burned villages and empty granaries. It was like trying to win a game of Monopoly with no properties left on the board. The infamous Russian winter, a character more ruthless than any general, soon joined the fray. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees C, degrees F, and Napoleon's troops, ill-prepared for such harsh conditions, began to drop like flies. Supplies dwindled, morale plummeted, and discipline unraveled. The logistical genius that had been Napoleon's ace in the hole backfired spectacularly in the endless Russian landscape. By the time the retreating army limped back across the Berezina River, they had suffered catastrophic losses. Of the 685,000 soldiers who had marched in, only about 27,000 returned in fighting shape. That's a survival rate lower than a snowball in a Russian summer. And let's not forget the human cost of Napoleon's hubris. The invasion not only depleted France's military might, but also drained its coffers. The financial burden of the campaign was a millstone around the neck of the French economy, which was already struggling under the weight of prolonged warfare. As for Napoleon, his aura of invincibility took a hit that no amount of spin could conceal. In the aftermath, Napoleon's emperor's new clothes moment became all too real. His reputation, once as polished as a freshly minted coin, now showed signs of tarnish. The myth of the invincible emperor was unraveling, and the world was starting to see the man behind the curtain, a leader whose ambition had outpaced his grasp. Yet, Napoleon's story was far from over. The Russian debacle, as disastrous as it was, didn't immediately end his reign. Like a seasoned gambler who knows when to hold M and when to fold M, Napoleon still had a few cards left to play. But with his enemies circling like sharks sensing blood in the water, the stage was set for a dramatic showdown that would determine the fate of Europe. In the grand theatre of history, Napoleon's military campaigns were a mix of triumph and tragedy, brilliance and blunder. He was a man who, despite his towering achievements, was all too human, prone to the same flaws and follies as the rest of us. As we delve deeper into his saga, remember this. The line between genius and madness is often as thin as a line drawn in the sand, easily swept away by the tides of time. And for Napoleon, those tides were beginning to turn. As the curtain rises on the final act of Napoleon's tumultuous reign, our leading man finds himself grappling with a new set of challenges that make his Russian escapade look like a walk through a Parisian park. The Peninsular War, often overshadowed by Napoleon's more glamorous campaigns, was a drawn-out debacle that bled the French Empire dry. Stretching from 1808 to 1814, this conflict turned the Iberian Peninsula into a quagmire that ensnared French forces in a mire of guerrilla warfare and local resistance, ultimately costing Napoleon over 300,000 troops, more than a few baguettes for the military ledger. The Spanish and Portuguese, backed by the ever-determined British under the Duke of Wellington, proved to be the persistent thorn in Napoleon's side. Picture a game of whack-a-mole where every time Napoleon thought he'd crushed one insurgency, another would pop up, often with a little help from the British, whose naval dominance ensured a steady supply of arms and support. For Napoleon, this wasn't just a military headache, it was a political migraine. The French public, already weary from years of war and economic strain, began to question the wisdom of their emperor's endless campaigns. As Napoleon's grip on the peninsula slipped, so too did his hold on Europe. The continental system, his ambitious but ultimately flawed economic blockade designed to cripple Britain by prohibiting European trade with them, backfired spectacularly. Instead of bringing Britain to its knees, it kneecapped the European economy, causing widespread economic chaos and resentment. Smuggling became the continent's favorite pastime, with British goods finding their way into Europe through back channels faster than you can say black market. The political fallout was inevitable. Napoleon's former allies began to eye the exit, and Austria, Prussia, and Russia were more than happy to oblige when the Sixth Coalition came calling in 1813. Cue the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, a clash that made previous battles look like schoolyard squabbles. With over 600,000 troops involved, it was the largest engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, and the outcome was a resounding defeat for Napoleon. His forces were shattered, and his empire's aura of invincibility was now well and truly shattered. By March 1814, the coalition forces were knocking on Paris's door, and Napoleon's once loyal marshals were advising surrender. Napoleon, ever the stubborn Corsican, wasn't ready to throw in the towel. But the writing was on the wall, and on April 6, 1814, he abdicated in favor of his son. The Allies, however, weren't interested in a Bonaparte sequel and sent him packing to the island of Elba. His first exile was exactly the stuff of dramatic tragedy. Rather, it was more like a reality TV show set on a Mediterranean island. Napoleon, the tiny emperor of a tiny island, was given sovereignty over Elba, complete with a personal guard of 600 men and a small navy. Instead of plotting his next conquest, he spent his days improving the island's infrastructure and social conditions. It was as if Napoleon had traded his sword for a shovel, and Elba became his sandbox. Yet the romantic notion of Napoleon, the benevolent ruler of Elba, is just that, a notion. The reality was that he was a lion in a cage, biding his time. Meanwhile, on the continent, the newly restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVII was about as popular as a rain-soaked picnic. The French public, nostalgic for the glory days of Napoleonic rule, started to grumble. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon made his audacious return in 1815, escaping Elba with a small force and landing in France to a hero's welcome. It was like the ultimate comeback tour, and within 100 days he was back in Paris, reclaiming his throne with all the flair of a rock star. But Napoleon's second act was short-lived. The powers of Europe, having just managed to put the cork back on the Napoleonic bottle, weren't about to let it pop again. They quickly rallied against him, leading to the climactic Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. Facing the combined forces of the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blucher, Napoleon's tactical brilliance wasn't enough to save him from a crushing defeat. The battlefield was a muddy quagmire of chaos, where Napoleon's strategy unraveled faster than a poorly knitted scarf. By the end of the day, his dreams of an empire lay in tatters, and the legend of Waterloo was born, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale of overreach and ambition. And so, Napoleon found himself on a one-way trip to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. If Elba was a gilded cage, then St. Helena was a solitary confinement cell. The British, this time, weren't taking any chances. His final years were spent in relative isolation, surrounded by a small entourage and under the watchful eye of his British captors. The romanticized image of Napoleon, the tragic hero languishing in exile, is compelling, but the truth was less poetic. He spent his days dictating memoirs, attempting to shape his legacy from afar, while battling deteriorating health and the confines of his new prison. Napoleon passed away on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, his dreams of glory reduced to the pages of history. His final words, reportedly, France, armée, théâtre d'armée, Joséphine, were a poignant reminder of the passions that drove him, his country, his army, and his first love. The world he left behind was irrevocably changed, a Europe reshaped by his ambition and the wars he waged. The Congress of Vienna, which convened to restore balance and order, redrew the map of Europe, establishing a diplomatic framework that would hold, more or less, until the outbreak of World War I. Napoleon's legacy is as complex as the man himself. On one hand, he was a military genius whose campaigns are still studied in military academies around the world. On the other, he was a despot whose ambition led to the deaths of millions and the destabilization of an entire continent. The Napoleonic Code, his enduring legacy, laid the groundwork for modern legal systems, yet his reign was marked by a relentless pursuit of power at any cost. In the end, Napoleon's story is a testament to the duality of human nature, the capacity for greatness and folly, brilliance and blindness. He was a man who dreamed grand dreams and chased them with a relentless drive that few could match. Yet his downfall serves as a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that the line between hero and tyrant is often drawn in the shifting sands of history. So, as you drift off to sleep with visions of battles and empires, remember this. Napoleon may have been the Corsican who conquered Europe, but he was also a man, flawed and fascinating, whose life was as much a cautionary tale as it was a saga of ambition and legacy. And in the grand tapestry of history, his story weaves a thread that continues to captivate and caution, a reminder that the past is always closer than we think, and that those who fail to learn from it are doomed to repeat it. If you think teenage rebellion is wild now, you've obviously not met Alexander the Great. This kid wasn't just sneaking out to party. He was getting tutored by Aristotle in between plotting his path to global domination. Born in 356 BC in Pella, the then capital of Macedonia, Alexander was the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. And let me tell you, the family dynamics were juicier than a royal soap opera. With a mom who claimed descent from Achilles, and a dad who was more interested in conquering the Greek city-states than in bedtime stories, Alexander's childhood was practically a prelude to his adult escapades. By the age of 13, Alexander was handed over to Aristotle, the philosopher who was basically the ancient equivalent of a walking, talking Wikipedia. Aristotle, whose own teacher was none other than Plato, had the unenviable task of turning this overly ambitious prince into a well-rounded ruler. And what did Aristotle teach him? Well, aside from the usual philosophy and ethics, there was a healthy dose of science, politics, and the kind of critical thinking that might just help you outsmart your enemies in battle, or at least make you look cultured while you do it. Now, Aristotle's influence on Alexander was immense, but let's not pretend it was all sunshine and Socratic dialogues. Alexander was a bit of a nerd, sure, but he was also a moody teenager who just as quickly get into a sword fight as he would a philosophical debate. He reportedly kept a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself, because why not make your bedtime reading a tale of epic warfare and divine intervention? But let's cut to the chase. Alexander's education wasn't just about reciting poetry or calculating the circumference of the earth. It was about preparing him for power. And boy, did he get a taste of it early on. At just 16, when most of us were busy figuring out how to parallel park, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia while his dad went off on a military campaign. It was like leaving a teenager the keys to a Ferrari and hoping he'd drive it responsibly. Spoiler alert, he didn't. During this time, a Thracian tribe called the Madi thought it'd be cute to revolt. Big mistake. Alexander, seizing his chance to flex those newly honed leadership muscles, crushed the rebellion and founded a city that he modestly named Alexandropolis. Imagine that. Your first city and you name it after yourself. Humility was clearly not on the syllabus. Now, about that whole child prodigy thing. It's tempting to think of young Alex as some sort of ancient Doogie Howser, but the reality is more complicated. The myth of the boy wonder conveniently ignores the fact that he was surrounded by some of the most competent military minds of his age. Sure, he was smart and charismatic, but he was also the product of an environment where military conquest was the family business. It's like being born into a dynasty of chefs. You're bound to know your way around the kitchen by osmosis alone. But let's not dismiss Alexander entirely. The kid had chops. He wasn't just riding on daddy's coattails. His early actions displayed a mix of audacity and strategic savvy that would define his later conquests. He was learning to play the chess game of politics and warfare. Only the stakes were entire cities and thousands of lives. And speaking of learning, let's not forget the economic and political backdrop to all this. Macedonia under Philip II was a powerhouse in the making, thanks in no small part to its lucrative silver mines and a reformed army. We're talking about a new kind of military machine here, a formidable phalanx formation, armed to the teeth with sarissas, those long spears that made the Macedonian infantry a force to be reckoned with. The kingdom's wealth and military prowess provided a solid foundation for Alexander's ambitions. It's a lot easier to dream big when you've got a full treasury and a standing army at your back. So here's young Alexander, with a philosopher's education, a warrior's training, and a king's resources. But what really set him apart wasn't just his upbringing or his early victories. It was his relentless drive to prove himself. He was a man with a point to make, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like self-doubt get in the way. In the years to come, Alexander would go on to carve out one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, but those stories are for another night. For now, just remember, before he was the Great, he was just Alexander, a teenager with a killer combination of brains, brawn, and a burning desire to leave his mark on history. And leave it he did, with a legacy that would echo through the ages, like a rock star whose greatest hits tour never ends, but with more swords and fewer guitars. But the rock star life isn't all about sold-out amphitheaters and adoring fans. Sometimes the encore is a hostile takeover in the family business. Enter 336 BC, a year that would have given any tabloid writer a heart attack from pure excitement. King Philip II, Alexander's dad, was assassinated during a wedding celebration. And no, it wasn't just awkward small talk with the in-laws that did him in. The real killer was a disgruntled former bodyguard named Pausanias, who decided the best way to deal with a bad workplace review was with a dagger, not exactly an HR-proved method. Now, imagine being 20 years old, watching your dad get offed at what should have been a festive party, and then having the weight of an entire kingdom dumped on your lap. Most of us would be hard-pressed to manage a group project at that age, let alone a whole empire. But Alexander, with his cocktail of ambition and ruthlessness, seized the moment. Before the candles on the wedding cake had even been blown out, he was declared king. Talk about a fast track to power. But hold your horses, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Alexander's ascent wasn't just a simple matter of inheritance. Think more Game of Thrones than Leave It to Beaver. There were plenty of power-hungry players who thought they could snatch the crown right out from under him. Among them was Attalus, a general who was quite cozy with the idea of his niece, Cleopatra, and her offspring with Philip claiming the throne. It was like a family reunion where everyone showed up with their own army. Alexander, no stranger to family drama, took swift action. He eliminated potential threats. Attalus was conveniently assassinated, and Cleopatra and her young son met a grim fate. If you thought family gatherings were tense, try adding a little regicide to the mix. In the ruthless world of Macedonian politics, Alexander knew that securing his throne meant leaving no loose ends. He was like a skilled chess player, removing every piece that could checkmate his kingship. With the internal threats handled, it was time to address the rebellious stirrings across Greece. You see, the Greek city-states had this pesky habit of thinking they could break free every time Macedonia sneezed. Athens and Thebes were particularly itchy for independence, probably hoping that the young king would be too green to maintain the iron grip his father had established. But Alexander was no pushover, and he was about to make that abundantly clear. First order of business, march south and remind these city-states just who was in charge. Alexander's approach was a mix of diplomacy and intimidation, like a mafia boss offering protection in exchange for allegiance. He gathered the League of Corinth, a coalition of Greek states, and essentially told them, "Join me, or you'll regret it." The message was crystal clear, and most of them fell in line. Those who didn't, like Thebes, faced the full wrath of Alexander's military machine. In 335 BC, Thebes made the grave mistake of revolting. Alexander's response was swift and brutal. Thebes was razed to the ground, its inhabitants either killed or sold into slavery. It was a move that screamed, "Don't mess with me," and it worked. The rest of Greece quickly got the memo. Alexander had transformed from the new kid on the block to the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Greek world. It was a unification act that was less about kumbaya and more about establishing dominance. Economically, this consolidation was a boon for Macedonia. With Greece firmly under control, Alexander had access to its resources, manpower, and, crucially, its naval ports. These were not just strategic military assets, but also vital for trade and commerce. The coffers of Macedonia swelled, providing the financial muscle needed for Alexander's ambitious plans. He was like a startup founder who just secured venture capital. The possibilities seemed endless. Now, let's bust a myth that often gets romanticized. The notion that Alexander was a visionary leader beloved by all. Sure, he had charisma and a knack for inspiring his men, but the reality was more complicated. His hold over Greece was as much about fear as it was about admiration. He was a master of psychological warfare, employing both carrot and stick with equal dexterity. It wasn't just his military prowess that kept the city-states in line. It was the ever-present threat of annihilation for those who dared defy him. So here we have Alexander, a young king who'd gone from zero to hero in record time. He'd secured his throne, quelled rebellion, and united Greece under his banner. But if you think this was the end of the story, think again. Alexander's ambitions were far from satisfied, and his next move would take him beyond the borders of Greece to the vast and mysterious land of Persia. But that, my friends, is a tale for another time. For now, remember this. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a master strategist who understood that power was as much about perception as it was about military might. Whether through sheer force or cunning diplomacy, he managed to turn a fragmented collection of city-states into a cohesive force, ready to follow him to the ends of the earth. And that's a legacy that's hard to argue with, even if it was built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and a fair bit of bloodshed. Now, with Greece under his belt and his enemies quaking in their sandals, Alexander turned his gaze eastward toward the Persian Empire. If you thought he'd stop at just unifying Greece, you clearly don't know our boy Alex. He wasn't going to be content with just being a big fish in a small pond. No, he was eyeing the ocean, specifically the vast, glittering expanse of the Persian Empire, the ancient world's equivalent of a luxury cruise liner filled with riches and ripe for the taking. Enter 334 BC, and Alexander is ready to launch his audacious campaign against Persia. But let's pump the brakes on the romance of a hero's quest and dive into the nitty-gritty. First up, logistics. Yeah, I know, not the sexiest topic, but think of it as the spreadsheet that underpins every epic tale. Alexander didn't just wake up one morning and decide to stroll into Persia with his army. It took meticulous planning, a lot of coin, and a whole lot of nerve. Picture this: Alexander standing on the brink of the Hellespont, today known as the Dardanelles, gazing across the water to Asia Minor, where legends of Persian wealth and power beckoned. He had 35,000 troops at his command, comprising 12,000 Macedonian infantry, 7,000 Greek allies, and a smattering of cavalry and mercenaries. This was no ragtag band of adventurers. It was a well-oiled military machine. But here's the kicker: they had to cross that pesky body of water first. The Hellespont wasn't just a geographic challenge, it was a psychological one. Crossing it was like stepping onto a new stage, one where the stakes were the entire known world. Now, let's talk economics. Wars aren't cheap, and Alexander wasn't exactly rolling in drachmas. The Macedonian treasury was stretched thin, and financing a campaign of this scale was akin to trying to pay off your student loans with a lemonade stand. But Alexander had a plan. He aimed to fund his war effort with the spoils of Persia itself. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble, a bit like going all in on a poker hand with a pair of threes. So, with his troops ready to go and his eyes set on the prize, Alexander made his move. The crossing of the Hellespont was a masterstroke of logistics. Imagine coordinating thousands of men, horses, and equipment onto a fleet of ships, and then praying Poseidon was in a good mood. The crossing wasn't just about logistics, though. It was a symbolic act of defiance against the Persian Empire. Alexander, ever the showman, knew the power of a grand gesture. Once across, it was time for the real fun to begin. The Battle of Granicus was Alexander's first major test against the Persians. Picture a wide-open plain near the river Granicus, where Alexander's forces faced off against a Persian army that included a hefty contingent of Greek mercenaries. Yep, the Persians had hired Greek soldiers to fight a Greek king. Talk about awkward family reunions. The battle itself was a chaotic, brutal affair. Alexander, leading from the front like the action hero he fancied himself to be, charged straight into the thick of it. His cavalry smashed into the Persian lines, and he personally took on the Persian satraps, regional governors who'd probably just been hoping for a quiet day at the office. At one point, Alexander came perilously close to meeting his maker when a Persian noble named Spithridates swung a sword at him. But a quick-thinking Macedonian officer, Cletus the Black, saved the day by lopping off Spithridates' arm. Talk about a close shave. The battle was a decisive victory for Alexander, but not without its toll. About 120 of his men were killed, while Persian losses were in the thousands. Numbers aside, the real victory was psychological. Alexander had shown that the Persian Empire wasn't the invincible juggernaut it was cracked up to be. And he did it with a mix of bravado and tactical brilliance, the kind of stuff that makes legends, and conveniently, good propaganda back home. But let's not get too caught up in the heroics. The reality of ancient warfare was anything but glamorous. Imagine the logistical nightmare of maintaining a supply line across foreign territory while trying to keep your troops fed, clothed, and crucially, paid. Alexander's campaign was as much about logistics as it was about battles. His supply lines had to stretch across hostile lands, a feat that required both military prowess and shrewd diplomacy to secure alliances with local rulers. It was the ancient equivalent of trying to organize a world tour without a single missed flight or lost guitar. And while we're myth-busting, let's talk about the so-called glory of battle. The romanticized version often skips over the mud, blood, and sheer exhaustion of ancient warfare. Alexander's men weren't just fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival, in a world where the consequences of defeat were often grim. The battlefield was a place of chaos and carnage, where the line between hero and statistic was perilously thin. Alexander's victory at Granicus opened the floodgates to Asia Minor. City after city fell to his forces, often opening their gates to him without a fight, persuaded by the combination of his military might and the promise of better governance, or at least less Persian interference. Economically, this was a boon for Alexander. Each conquest brought new resources, new recruits, and crucially, new income streams. He was effectively building a franchise, with each new city adding to his empire's bottom line. But conquering is one thing. Holding on to those conquests is another. Alexander wasn't just a military genius. He was a shrewd administrator, too. In the cities he conquered, he installed loyal Macedonian governors and garrisons to maintain control. He was building an empire, and that required more than just a sword and a battle cry. It required an infrastructure of power. As Alexander continued his march across Asia Minor, the Persian Empire began to realize that this wasn't just another Greek raid to be shrugged off. This was a concerted effort to topple their entire empire. Darius III, the Persian king, was finally starting to sit up and take notice. But that's a tale for another time, as Alexander's ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Asia Minor. For now, let's leave Alexander on the cusp of even greater conquests, with his eyes set on the heart of Persia itself. But remember this, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a master of logistics, a shrewd tactician, and a canny politician. His victories were as much about strategy and cunning as they were about brute force. And in the coming chapters of his saga, those qualities would be tested like never before. Stay tuned because the best, or the most dramatic at least, is yet to come. With the scent of victory still fresh from his escapades in Asia Minor, Alexander set his eyes on Egypt. If you thought he was just going to waltz in and call it a day, think again. Egypt was a different beast altogether, more pyramids, fewer Greeks, and a heck of a lot of sand. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Alexander wasn't just there for a suntan and a camel ride. He was there to add another jewel to his burgeoning empire. In 332 BC, Alexander marched into Egypt, a land under the thumb of the Persian Empire. Now, you might think the Egyptians would be grumbling about swapping one overlord for another, but nope. Instead, they practically rolled out the red carpet. Why? Because the Persians were about as popular as a heat wave in July, and Alexander, with his youthful charm and military swagger, seemed like a refreshing change. It was a bit like swapping out a strict substitute teacher for one who lets you watch movies in class. Upon his arrival, Alexander was hailed as a liberator. The Egyptians were so thrilled to see the back of their Persian governors that they welcomed him with open arms. And what did Alexander do? He played the role of the benevolent conqueror to a T. It was like he'd been to charm school. But here's the kicker. Alexander didn't just want to be a king, he wanted to be a god. Enter the title of pharaoh, or, as the Egyptians might have called it, divine ruler extraordinaire. Now, being a pharaoh wasn't just about wearing snazzy headgear and reclining on a throne. It was a PR goldmine. In the ancient world, pharaohs were seen as living gods, and Alexander knew this was his ticket to divine legitimacy. Why settle for being just another king when you could be a god king? It was the ultimate ancient world flex. This wasn't just about power. It was about crafting a legacy that even the most hardened historians couldn't ignore. But let's pause for a moment and question this divine status. Was Alexander really seen as a god by everyone, or was it a clever bit of spin? The truth is, it was probably a bit of both. To the Egyptians, who were accustomed to divine rulers, Alexander's claim might have seemed plausible, even if it was a convenient fiction to ensure a smooth transition of power. To his Macedonian troops, however, who were more used to gruff generals than godly figures, it was likely a source of bemusement. After all, they'd seen him with bedhead and morning breath, hardly the stuff of celestial beings. But Alexander didn't stop there. No, he had more grandiose plans up his well-armored sleeve. In 331 BC, he founded the city of Alexandria, a move that was both strategic and symbolic. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, it was a prime location for trade and military logistics. But more than that, it was a statement, a new city for a new era. Alexandria wasn't just going to be any city. It was destined to be a hub of culture, learning, and commerce. Think of it as the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, minus the tech startups and overpriced coffee. Building a city from scratch was no small feat. It required manpower, resources, and a vision that extended beyond the immediate. Alexander, ever the visionary, wanted Alexandria to be a melting pot of Greek and Egyptian cultures. He didn't just want to conquer lands. He wanted to blend them, to create something new and enduring. It was an ambitious goal, one that would take years, if not centuries, to fully realize. But the groundwork was laid, and the city would go on to become one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria. Talk about a legacy. Now, let's not forget the economic factors at play. Alexandria wasn't just a cultural project, it was an economic engine. By founding the city, Alexander secured a vital link in the trade networks that crisscrossed the Mediterranean and beyond. Egypt was a breadbasket, rich in grain and resources, and Alexandria was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this wealth. It was the ancient equivalent of setting up shop on a prime piece of real estate, with trade routes extending like spokes on a wheel. But not everything in Egypt was sunshine and lotus flowers. Alexander's time there wasn't without its blunders. While he may have been a military genius, his understanding of Egyptian culture and politics was, let's say, a work in progress. There were moments of cultural exchange that bordered on the cringeworthy, like a tourist trying to blend in by butchering the local language. But these missteps didn't overshadow the fact that Alexander's presence in Egypt left an indelible mark. As Alexander continued his campaign, the mix of genuine admiration and opportunistic propaganda surrounding his achievements only grew. He was a master of crafting his own narrative, ensuring that his exploits were recorded in a way that would make any PR professional proud. His victories were celebrated with the kind of fanfare that would make a modern influencer blush, and his divine claims were strategically amplified to cement his status as both a ruler and a legend. Yet, while Alexander's image was carefully curated, it's important to remember the human beneath the myth. He was a man driven by ambition, yes, but also by a genuine curiosity about the world. His attempts to blend cultures, to create new cities and new ways of governance, were as much about exploration as they were about conquest. He wasn't content with the status quo. He wanted to reshape it, to leave a legacy that would echo through the ages. So, as we leave Alexander in Egypt, basking in his newfound divinity and plotting his next move, it's clear that his journey was far from over. The sands of Egypt may have shifted beneath his feet, but his eyes were already set on the horizons beyond. For Alexander, the world was a stage, and he was just getting started. The curtain was about to rise on his next act, and if you thought Egypt was impressive, wait until you see what he had in store for the rest of the ancient world. Stay tuned, because Alexander's story is one of epic proportions, filled with twists, turns, and enough drama to keep historians on their toes for millennia. As Alexander's ambitions reached fever pitch, his eyes turned to the mysterious lands beyond the Indus River, where the fabled riches of India awaited. But let's not pretend this was a leisurely stroll. By 326 BC, Alexander's army was weary from years of relentless campaigning. These guys weren't just tired, they were exhausted, having marched thousands of miles, much of it across inhospitable terrain. They'd faced everything from scorching deserts to treacherous mountain passes. Frankly, they'd seen enough of the world's worst travel brochure. At the heart of the matter was the Hyphasis River, now known as the Beas River, in what is today Punjab, India. Here, Alexander faced his first real mutiny. His troops, loyal but human, finally said, "Enough already." It's like when your GPS keeps recalculating and you've had it with the detours. They were done with the endless march, done with the battles, and definitely done with the exotic diseases that came as unwelcome souvenirs. They wanted to go home, see their families, maybe open a tavern or just sleep in a bed that wasn't a tent. Alexander, ever the charismatic leader, tried to rally his men with promises of glory and riches. He spoke of conquering lands where the streets were supposedly paved with gold. But even the most persuasive pep talk can't compete with sheer exhaustion and homesickness. It was a reality check for Alexander, a moment when he realized he couldn't conquer the world on sheer willpower alone, not when his army was on the brink of mutiny. So what did Alexander do? He sulked, seriously. The accounts describe him as retreating to his tent, refusing food and sulking like a child denied dessert. Eventually, practicality won out, and he reluctantly agreed to turn back. It was a rare but significant concession from a man who had rarely encountered the word no in his lifetime. It was like watching Superman realize he had limits, humbling, yet humanizing. With the decision made, Alexander began the long journey back, a trek that was anything but straightforward. The return path took him through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert. Now, if you ever want to test your mettle, the Gedrosian desert is your place. Imagine blistering heat, scarce water, and shifting sands as far as the eye can see. Alexander's army suffered greatly. Many died from heat and exhaustion. It was a brutal reminder that even a god-king was at the mercy of nature's whims. As if the desert wasn't enough, Alexander faced yet another challenge when he returned to Babylon in 323 BC. He'd been living life at breakneck speed, and the toll was evident. Accounts suggest that he came down with a fever after one too many wine-fueled banquets, because apparently moderation wasn't in his vocabulary. On June 10th, 323 BC, at the ripe old age of 32, Alexander the Great breathed his last. Talk about a plot twist. The man who had seemed invincible, destined for greatness, was suddenly gone. Now let's tackle the myths surrounding his death. Was it poison, malaria, typh? Historians have debated this for centuries, with theories ranging from the plausible to the downright conspiratorial. The truth is, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that his empire, like a sandcastle at high tide, began to crumble almost immediately after his death, without a clear successor, because, surprise, Alexander had a penchant for conquering more than for estate planning. His empire was divided among his generals, known as the Diadochi. Picture a group of kids grabbing at a piñata's spoils, and you'll get the idea. The once unified empire descended into chaos, with each general carving out their own piece of the pie. The wars that followed were as bloody and brutal as anything Alexander had waged, proving that his legacy was as much about conflict as it was about conquest. And speaking of legacy, let's get real. Was Alexander's greatness his destiny, or just a historical happenstance? Sure, he was brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious, but he was also a product of his time, a time when military might and territorial expansion were the currency of power. He had the right mix of resources, education, and opportunities, plus a fair bit of luck. If you think about it, he was like a rock star born in the age of vinyl, perfect timing, and the right medium to amplify his talents. Yet, despite the chaos he left behind, Alexander's impact was undeniable. His conquests spread Greek culture and ideas far beyond their origins, influencing everything from architecture to philosophy. The cities he founded, like Alexandria in Egypt, became beacons of learning and culture long after his empire dissolved. It's like he left behind not just a world map with his name scribbled all over it, but a blueprint for cultural exchange. In the end, Alexander the Great remains a complex figure, a man of extraordinary vision and ambition, but also of hubris and human frailty. His life was a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, woven together by the relentless pursuit of a legacy that would echo through the ages. Whether that legacy was his destiny or simply a consequence of his times is a question that keeps historians up at night. But perhaps the answer doesn't matter as much as the lessons we draw from his story. That greatness is often a double-edged sword, and that the pursuit of it can lead to both glory and ruin. So, as you drift off to sleep, consider this. Alexander's story is a reminder of the human desire to reach beyond our grasp, to leave a mark on the world that says, "I was here." And in that quest, we find both our greatest achievements and our most poignant failures. It's a tale as old as time, yet as relevant as ever. A reminder that history, like life, is as much about the journey as it is about the destination. In the bustling era of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meandered not just through the land, but through the very veins of civilization, you might say the world had its first taste of two-day shipping. And just like that modern marvel, it was all about location, location, location. Nestled between these two mighty rivers, Mesopotamia was the geographical equivalent of a prime real estate listing, with the added bonus of no HOA fees, just the occasional flood or drought to keep things interesting. Now, let's dive headlong into the muddy reality of Mesopotamia's geography, which might have looked like a cartographer's fever dream, but was, in fact, the beating heart of what we grandly call the cradle of civilization. Forget the romanticized notion of gentle riverbanks and serene agricultural communities. This was a place where geography dictated destiny, and trade routes were as vital as oxygen. If ancient Mesopotamians had sported bumper stickers, they would have read, "No roads, no problem." Because they had the Tigris and Euphrates, their highways of commerce and culture. These rivers didn't just flow. They fueled an economic engine that powered city-states like Uruk and Babylon, the New York and Los Angeles of the ancient world, minus the overpriced lattes. Uruk, dating back to around 4000 BCE, was one of the first major cities, with a population peaking over 50,000. It was a metropolis where trade wasn't just a side hustle, but the main gig. The city boasted of ziggurats that reached for the heavens, albeit with all the aesthetic elegance of a concrete block. Meanwhile, Babylon swooned into prominence around 1894 BCE, eventually growing into an empire under Hammurabi's rule. Yes, the one with the code that would make even Judge Judy raise an eyebrow. The rivers did more than just provide water. They were the silk ribbons that wove together the diverse cultures and economies of the region. Goods from as far away as the Indus Valley, that's 1,500 miles away, if you're counting, were traded along these waterways, making Mesopotamia a multicultural hub long before globalization was a thing. Spices, textiles, precious metals, and ideas flowed as freely as the water itself. The rivers were the original social network, sans the drama of status updates. But before you get swept away by the romantic notion of ancient riverine idyls, let's slam the brakes and talk muddy roads. Yes, those paths that connected the bustling markets of Uruk and the storied gardens of Babylon were more like challenging obstacle courses. Picture trying to haul your wares through a landscape where rain turned paths into mucky quagmires, and dry spells left them dusty and rutted. It was a logistical nightmare, and yet people thrived. Why? Because necessity is the mother of invention, and a little mud never stopped a determined merchant with a cart full of barley. Now, let's not forget the lack of Wi-Fi, which, while a modern inconvenience, speaks volumes about the ingenuity of the ancients. Without the luxury of instant communication, traders and travelers relied on word of mouth, hand-delivered messages, and the ever-reliable carrier pigeon. It's a wonder they managed at all, but manage they did, creating a network of trade that set the stage for future empires. So, what was the secret sauce that allowed Mesopotamia to flourish amid such geographical challenges? It was a cocktail of innovation, adaptation, and sheer grit. The inhabitants mastered irrigation, turning the flood-prone plains into fertile fields. They developed cuneiform writing, the ancient world's equivalent of a spreadsheet, to keep tabs on transactions and inventories. This wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving in a world where the landscape was both a relentless adversary and a generous provider. In unraveling the geographical significance of Mesopotamia, it's clear that this land was more than just a cradle. It was a crucible. It was where human ingenuity was tested and tempered, where the interplay between water and land crafted a civilization that would leave an indelible mark on history. As we continue to explore this ancient world, it's essential to remember that behind the grand narratives of kings and conquests lies the muddy reality of everyday life, a reality that was as gritty as it was glorious. Now, speaking of grit and glory, let's veer away from muddy roads and take a closer look at the real stars of the show, the Mesopotamian merchants and their clay tablets. You see, while modern-day business moguls might jet-set with laptops in hand, the Sumerians had their own version of spreadsheets. Only theirs were a bit heavier and decidedly less portable. Imagine lugging around a clay tablet every time you wanted to check your balance. Talk about a workout plan. These tablets were inscribed with cuneiform script, a writing system that was as intricate as it was essential. Forget the feather quill or ballpoint pen. Back then, a stylus and some wet clay were all you needed to record the comings and goings of goods like barley, dates, and wool. The Mesopotamians were masters of agricultural abundance, and they knew how to keep track of it. Barley was the staple, the bread and butter, if you will, of their economy. And by bread and butter, I mean it was literally the stuff they made bread and beer with, two essentials for any burgeoning civilization. But let's not stop at the everyday groceries. The Mesopotamians were also trading in the bling of the ancient world, lapis lazuli. This deep blue semi-precious stone was the ultimate status symbol, sourced from as far away as Afghanistan, over 1,500 miles away. To put it into perspective, that's like taking a road trip from New York to Dallas just to grab a piece of fancy jewelry. If you had lapis lazuli, you weren't just in the game. You were winning it. It was the bling that could make a pharaoh blush, if only Egypt had more of it. Now, the Sumerians didn't just sit back and let the goods roll in. They were proactive, savvy business people. They developed credit systems that would make even modern bankers nod in approval. Imagine a world where you didn't need a wallet full of plastic cards, but instead, you had a clay token of trust. It was all about reputation, relationships, and the ability to deliver on promises. A bit like a LinkedIn recommendation, but with more clay and less digital footprint. This wasn't just an economic system. It was a social contract. Merchants built networks of trust that spanned city-states and even reached distant lands. They had to, because when you're trading with folks from thousands of miles away, you can't exactly pop over for a chat. They navigated these relationships with the precision of a diplomat and the cunning of a blackjack dealer. The marketplaces of cities like Uruk and Babylon weren't just buzzing with the sound of haggling. They were alive with the clash of cultures. Imagine the din of languages, the mix of accents, and the colorful array of goods. One moment you're swapping barley for wool, and the next, you're bartering for the latest shipment of spice from the Indus Valley. It was a cacophony of commerce that would make even the most seasoned traders head spin. And oh, the credit systems. These were not your run-of-the-mill IOUs. The Sumerians had contracts and codes that rivaled the complexity of modern legal systems. Hammurabi's code, for example, wasn't just about justice. It was about ensuring that everyone knew the rules of the trading game. If you were caught trying to pull a fast one, you'd better believe there were consequences. It was less about retribution and more about keeping the economic machine humming smoothly. In this world of clay and commerce, the Sumerians thrived not just because of what they traded, but how they managed those trades. They were the original bean counters, keeping meticulous records that would make any accountant today weep with envy. Why all the fuss over barley and wool, you ask? Because these weren't just commodities. They were the lifeblood of the Mesopotamian economy. They fed the people, clothed them, and kept the wheels of trade turning. So, while the rivers were the highways and the tablets the spreadsheets, it was the people, the merchants with their keen acumen and their clay credit systems, that truly drove the Mesopotamian economy. They were the unsung heroes of the ancient world, the ones who turned mud into gold and set the stage for the civilizations that followed. As we delve deeper into the world of ancient trade, let's keep an eye on these shrewd traders, for they are the key to understanding how a civilization rose from the banks of two rivers and left an indelible mark on history. As these merchants of yore navigated the muddy rivers and complex trade deals, they were unknowingly setting the stage for a cultural exchange that would turn Mesopotamia into a veritable melting pot of ideas, stories, and scribbles on clay. Let's start with the spread of cuneiform writing, which was about as revolutionary back then as the internet is today. Forget emojis. Cuneiform was all about those wedge-shaped marks that could mean anything from a bushel of barley to a cosmic deity. This script wasn't just for tallying goods or sending love notes, though I'm sure there was plenty of that. It was the medium through which epic tales and legal codes were inscribed, ensuring that Mesopotamian culture didn't just stay put. Like a persistent travel blogger, cuneiform hitched rides with traders and diplomats, making its way across borders faster than you can say Babylonian. By 2500 BCE, this writing system had spread to Elam, Assyria, and even Anatolia, leaving an indelible mark on the bureaucratic and literary practices of those regions. Speaking of epic tales, have you heard of Gilgamesh? If not, buckle up, because this is where Mesopotamian influence truly flexes its muscles. The Epic of Gilgamesh, dating back to around 2100 BCE, is the granddaddy of all epic literature. Think Homer, but with more floods and fewer Greek gods. This saga of a Sumerian king's quest for immortality wasn't just bedtime reading for ancient scholars. It was a cultural juggernaut that spread far and wide, embedding itself in the mythological DNA of neighboring civilizations. As traders and travelers carried clay tablets and oral stories along trade routes, the legends of Gilgamesh and his bromance with Enkidu found listeners in places as far-flung as the Levant and Egypt. Talk about a viral hit. This tale of friendship, heroism, and existential dread struck a chord, influencing everything from Hebrew scriptures to Greek mythology. The flood story in Gilgamesh, for instance, bears an uncanny resemblance to a certain biblical deluge. Coincidence? I think not. But it wasn't just stories that caught a ride on the trade winds. Mesopotamian gods and myths were also busy packing their bags. As traders exchanged goods, they also exchanged cultural beliefs, leading to a spiritual exchange program that would make any mythologist swoon. Deities like Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, became household names beyond Mesopotamia's borders, morphing into counterparts like the Hittite goddess Shorshka and the Phoenician Astarte. It's like watching a deity go on a world tour, picking up new fans and alter egos along the way. This religious syncretism wasn't just about swapping gods like trading cards. It was a reflection of how interconnected these ancient societies were, despite the challenges of geography and communication. The blending of myths and deities helped forge shared cultural identities, smoothing the way for alliances and trade agreements. In a world where divine approval was as crucial as a solid credit rating, having gods with passports was a real perk. Now, let's address the elephant in the ziggurat, the notion that these exchanges were always peaceful and mutually beneficial. Spoiler alert, they were. While the romantic image of harmonious cultural blending is appealing, the reality often involved a fair amount of power plays and cultural appropriation. For every amicable exchange of ideas, there was a ruler or priest eager to impose their beliefs on others, sometimes with less than gentle persuasion. Yet, despite the occasional clash, the cultural osmosis that trade facilitated left a legacy that modern archaeologists are still sifting through today. The Mesopotamians didn't just trade in goods, they traded in ideas, and those ideas had staying power. From the legal principles enshrined in Hammurabi's code to the poetic tales of Gilgamesh, the cultural contributions of Mesopotamia were like a fine wine, aging well, even as they traveled great distances. This cultural diffusion wasn't a one-way street, either. Just as Mesopotamia exported its myths and scripts, it also imported influences from other cultures. The interaction with the Indus Valley civilization, for example, brought new agricultural techniques and possibly even new script styles. It was a two-way exchange that enriched everyone involved, like a potluck where everyone brings their best dish, minus the awkward small talk. So, as we chart the course of Mesopotamian influence, it's clear that these ancient traders were more than just merchants. They were the original influencers, spreading culture and ideas as they bartered and bantered their way across continents. Their legacy is a testament to the power of curiosity and connection, showing us that even in a world without Wi-Fi or Google Maps, humans have always found ways to share their stories and shape their destinies. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of Mesopotamian history, remember that behind every clay tablet and ancient myth lies a story of human ambition and resilience. These are tales of a civilization that, through trade and exchange, left a mark on the world that resonates even today. And as we prepare to delve deeper into the intricacies of this ancient world, let's keep our eyes peeled for the traces of these early cultural exchanges that continue to echo through the corridors of history. Now, as we continue our jaunt through ancient Mesopotamia, let's pause to flip the coin and peer at the less glamorous side of life in this cradle of civilization. Sure, it sounds all sparkly when you talk about the grand ziggurats and bustling trade routes, but let's not kid ourselves. Life wasn't all lapis lazuli and barley beer. First up, let's tackle the myth of endless prosperity in Mesopotamia, which is about as accurate as calling a desert lush. Yes, there was wealth, but it was hardly an egalitarian utopia. The reality was more akin to a pyramid scheme, except the only thing getting built was actual pyramids, or ziggurats, if we're being historically precise. While some folks were rolling in the riches, a significant chunk of the population was slogging through what we might call back-breaking work. And folks, that's not just a metaphor. Consider the average laborer in the fields or on construction sites. These weren't your cushy 9-to-5 gigs. No, the workday would typically start at the crack of dawn and stretch until dusk, under the relentless sun. Laborers were tasked with everything from dragging massive stones for building projects to toiling in the fields to ensure that the urban elite never ran out of bread or, heaven forbid, beer. This wasn't the kind of work you could just phone in, and it's safe to say that OSHA wasn't exactly keeping an eye on working conditions. But why was there such a stark economic disparity? Well, the social hierarchy in Mesopotamia was about as rigid as the clay tablets they loved so much. At the top, you had the priests, kings, and nobles. Let's call them the ancient 1%. Below them were the merchants and artisans, who managed a decent living thanks to their skills and savvy. But for the majority, life was a series of grueling tasks with little hope for upward mobility. Being born into a privileged family was like hitting the jackpot of life, while the rest had to make do with whatever hand they were dealt. Speaking of social mobility, or the lack thereof, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of Mesopotamian society. If you were born a slave, well, tough cookies. That's probably where you'd stay. Slavery wasn't based on race as it tragically came to be in later societies. Rather, it was often a consequence of war, debt, or even being born to enslaved parents. Your best shot at freedom might come from paying off a debt or being set free by a benevolent master. But let's be honest, benevolence wasn't exactly trending. Even the free citizens weren't exactly living the Mesopotamian dream. Many worked as tenant farmers, handing over a hefty share of their harvest to landowners. Imagine working your fingers to the bone only to see the fruits of your labor carted off in someone else's chariot. And let's not forget the women who, despite having some legal rights, were often relegated to domestic roles. Sure, you could own property or run a business if you were lucky, but more often than not, you'd be running the household while the men cut deals and traded goods. Now, here's a fun fact to drop at your next dinner party. The Mesopotamians were pioneers of taxation. Yes, those bustling markets and fertile fields were all subject to taxation, because what good is prosperity if you can't skim a little off the top right? Taxes could be paid in grain, livestock, or goods, and failure to pay up could land you in hot water, or more accurately, a debtor's prison. King Hammurabi, the same guy who laid down the law with his famous code, ensured that taxes were an integral part of maintaining the state's coffers. So, if you ever find yourself grumbling about modern tax returns, just remember that this financial tradition has been annoying humans for millennia. In terms of governance, while it might be tempting to imagine benevolent rulers sitting on their thrones, sipping date wine and pondering the welfare of their subjects, reality was a bit harsher. Kings were often more concerned with expanding their territories and power than with the plight of the common folk. Wars were frequent, and while victorious campaigns could bring in slaves and tributes, they also meant that ordinary citizens might be conscripted into military service, a draft lottery that you definitely didn't want to win. And let's not romanticize the urban living conditions. Cities like Uruk and Babylon, despite their grandeur, could be breeding grounds for disease. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, with sewage systems that would make a modern plumber weep. The streets could be teeming with refuse, and drinking water wasn't always the sparkling spring variety. Epidemics could sweep through the population with devastating effects, which was exactly the good life the scribes might have etched into clay. So why does this matter? Why pull back the curtain on the less savory sides of ancient life? Because it paints a fuller picture of the human experience. Mesopotamia was more than its grandiose myths and legendary kings. It was a society built on the backs of many who faced hardship daily. Understanding this adds depth to our appreciation of their achievements, showing us that history is a tapestry woven with both triumph and toil. But before we sink too deeply into existential despair, let's remember that even in the face of these challenges, Mesopotamians showcased remarkable resilience and creativity. They adapted to their circumstances, using wit and willpower to navigate a complex world. Their struggles were real, but so were their stories, their innovations, and their contributions to the tapestry of human history. And as we proceed to explore more of this ancient world, keep in mind that the past isn't just a museum of relics. It's a mirror reflecting the enduring spirit of humanity. As we prepare to delve further into the world that flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates, remember that this journey through time isn't just about admiring the pinnacles of civilization. It's about acknowledging the valleys as well, where the everyday person carved out a life amid the grandeur and grit. The Mesopotamians, with all their flaws and fortitude, remind us that history is as much about the unsung as it is about the celebrated. So gear up as we continue to peel back the layers of this ancient world, revealing the vibrant, messy, and altogether fascinating story of Mesopotamia. As we prepare to peel back the final layers of Mesopotamia's ancient world, let's talk legacy, the stuff that lasts longer than a tick-tock trend or the lifespan of your average smartphone. Mesopotamians were the original pioneers of civilization, and their fingerprints are all over our modern world. From bureaucracy to brewing, they were the OGs of many things we take for granted today. Let's start by raising a glass of barley beer, naturally, to their knack for innovation. Mesopotamia was the birthplace of writing, and that wasn't just a happy accident. Around 3200 BCE, they cracked the code with cuneiform, a writing system that made our modern alphabet look like child's play. With over 1,000 characters at its peak, Cuneiform was the Swiss army knife of writing. It could tally up grain, tell epic tales, and even jot down the occasional love letter. This wasn't just scribbling on clay, it was the dawn of recorded history. And speaking of recording, let's not forget about Hammurabi's Code, around 1754 BCE, which was the first legal system to be written down. With 282 laws etched into stone, it was the ancient version of terms and conditions. But with actual consequences. Next time you're grumbling about jury duty, remember that we owe our entire legal framework to these ancient scribes and their penchant for keeping everyone honest, or at least trying to. Now, let's chew over another Mesopotamian contribution, agriculture. They didn't just plant seeds, they sowed the future. Their invention of irrigation around 6000 BCE turned desert plains into fertile fields, ensuring that the cradle of civilization didn't become a cradle of starvation. Those irrigation canals weren't just ditches, they were lifelines, feeding an ever-growing population and setting the stage for future agricultural empires. Switching gears to the economic front, Mesopotamians were the original hustlers, mastering trade networks that would make today's Wall Street look like a lemonade stand. By 2000 BCE, they had trade routes stretching as far as the Indus Valley and Egypt, bringing back everything from spices to stone. They didn't just swap goods, they exchanged ideas, languages, and cultures. Imagine the Silk Road minus the silk, but with just as much cultural exchange. But before you get too starry-eyed about their economic prowess, remember that this wasn't a utopia of free trade and happy merchants. The Mesopotamian economy was a harsh mistress, complete with taxes, debts, and financial pitfalls that could ruin a merchant faster than you can say, market crash. Yet, it was these very challenges that sparked innovation, like the credit systems that were the great-grandparents of our modern banking institutions. Who knew clay tablets could teach us so much about fiscal responsibility? While we're talking economics, let's give a nod to the artisans and craftsmen who turned raw materials into cultural masterpieces. From jewelry to pottery, Mesopotamian art was both a status symbol and a form of cultural expression. Their knack for craftsmanship wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about identity, a way to leave their mark on the world, literally and figuratively. Think about it. Those intricate designs were the ancient world's version of a brand logo, instantly recognizable and deeply significant. And what about those ziggurats, the towering temples that reached for the sky? They weren't just architectural feats, they were social and religious hubs, bringing people together in worship and community. These massive structures, like the one in built around 2100 BCE, were the skyscrapers of their day, a testament to human ambition and the desire to connect with the divine. They remind us that, even in ancient times, people were always looking for something greater than themselves. Now, let's dial it back to culture, because Mesopotamia was more than just trade and temples. It was a melting pot of myth and legend, a place where stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh were born. This wasn't just a tale of heroism. It was a reflection of the human condition, a narrative that probed the questions of life and death, friendship and legacy. It was the original existential crisis, long before Kafka made it cool. So, what can we learn from these ancient innovators? First, that necessity truly is the mother of invention. Faced with environmental challenges and economic pressures, the Mesopotamians didn't just survive, they thrived. They showed us that human ingenuity knows no bounds, whether it's inventing writing or figuring out how to turn floodplains into farmland. Second, they demonstrate the importance of cultural exchange. In a world increasingly defined by borders, Mesopotamia reminds us that ideas, like goods, are meant to flow freely. Their legacy is a testament to the power of curiosity and collaboration, principles that continue to drive human progress. Finally, let's not overlook their cautionary tales. For all their achievements, Mesopotamia also faced its share of societal collapse, environmental degradation, and economic disparity. These challenges remind us that the structures we build, both literal and metaphorical, are only as strong as the foundations we lay. As we navigate the complexities of our modern world, the lessons of Mesopotamia urge us to balance innovation with sustainability, ambition with empathy. As we wrap up our journey through the land between the rivers, let's take a moment to appreciate the Mesopotamians for the legacy they left behind. A legacy that's as enduring as the clay tablets that bore their stories. They were dreamers and doers, creators and collaborators, leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of human history. So next time you write a text, balance your checkbook, or simply marvel at a sunset, remember that you're standing on the shoulders of giants who lived thousands of years ago. And as we continue to chart our own course through history, let's carry forward the spirit of the Mesopotamians, blending innovation with imagination, and striving always for a better tomorrow. In the shadowy recesses of history, where myth and fact often blur like a poorly tuned radio, gladiator fights in ancient Rome emerge not as the glittering Hollywood blockbusters we've been led to believe, but as something far grittier, an Etruscan funeral rite that got wildly out of hand. That's right, folks. Before gladiators were the rock stars of the Colosseum, they were basically a sideshow at funerals. Somewhere along the way, the Romans thought, hey, why not turn Uncle Vespasian's wake into a public spectacle? And a spectacle it became, evolving faster than a charioteer on a caffeine high. Let's hit rewind to around the 6th century BCE, when the Etruscans, those mysterious folks from whom the Romans borrowed more than a few ideas, were doing their thing in what is now Italy. The Etruscans had this quaint custom of staging fights between slaves at funerals to honor the dead. Quaint being a euphemism for disturbing. But hey, different strokes for different folks, right? These early brawls were supposed to be a nod to the whole life-death-rebirth thing. Kind of like a macabre version of the circle of life, but with more blood and fewer singing animals. Fast forward to Rome, where they adopted this tradition, and in true Roman fashion, supersized it. How did these funerary rites morph into the blood-soaked circus we know and love today? Well, the Romans had a knack for taking something small and personal and turning it into a colossal public affair. By the time we hit the late Republic, around the 1st century BCE, gladiator games had outgrown funerals and were now the hottest ticket in town. Picture your favorite sports event, but with a lot more at stake than just a trophy. The economic angle is where things get even juicier. Gladiator games became a major cash cow, a veritable gold mine for those who knew how to play the game, and play it they did. The costs were as staggering as the fights were brutal. A decent gladiator could cost anywhere from 3,000 to 15,000 sesterces, which is about as much as a good racing chariot. And don't even get me started on the top-tier gladiators, the ones with skills so sharp they could slice the air. They were the Beckham or Ronaldo of the arena, commanding prices that could make a senator swoon. However, investing in a gladiator wasn't just about the initial purchase. You had to feed them, train them, house them, essentially run a mini Hogwarts, but for fighters. Lannister, the managers and trainers, were like the sports agents of their day, often coming from the ranks of former gladiators themselves. They were in it for the sesterces and the clout, because nothing said, "I've made it," in ancient Rome like owning a stable of the finest fighters ready to spill blood for glory. Now here's the kicker. The games weren't just about entertainment. They were a potent tool of political propaganda. Politicians bankrolled these games to curry favor with the masses, a bit like buying votes with bread and circuses. Julius Caesar, that shrewd operator, famously threw a lavish gladiator show in 65 BCE with 320 pairs of fighters to boost his popularity. Talk about an extravagant campaign rally. And the public. They ate it up like a 5-star banquet. Gladiator fights were the talk of the town, the social event you had to see to believe. They were as much a staple of Roman life as the toga or the bathhouse. The games transcended mere combat. They were about identity, power, and the very essence of what it meant to be Roman. But let's not get too carried away by the romance of it all. Behind the glamour and the gore were the harsh realities. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. For them, the arena was more about survival than spectacle. Sure, a few lucky ones might earn their freedom and celebrity status, but for most, The sand of the Colosseum was where dreams went to die. So the next time you picture a gladiator fight, think less Gladiator, the movie, and more Gladiator, the gritty, bloody business of life and death. Because while the legend is glorious, the reality was as raw as the wounds left in the wake of a battle. Now, let's not kid ourselves. The life of a gladiator was about as glamorous as a sewer rat's, except with more sharp objects involved. Let's peel back the layers of the arena and dive into the gritty world of the gladiators themselves. Those brawny stars who could make or break an emperor's popularity faster than you can say, "I came, I saw, I conquered." First off, let's talk diversity. Gladiators came from all walks of life, though none of them were exactly strolling through a field of daisies. Many were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals, but there were also those who chose the path voluntarily. You know, the thrill-seekers and the desperate. Just imagine. One day you're a Gaul fighting for your tribe. The next you're shipped off to Rome and told to entertain the masses by fighting another poor soul in a sandy pit. If that's not an extreme career pivot, I don't know what is. Then there was the social hierarchy, more complex than a Roman soap opera. At the top of the gladiatorial food chain were the secutors and *rescere*, the superstars of the arena. The secutors were heavily armored, designed to withstand the blows of their nimble counterparts, the *, who fought with nets and tridents. Think of it as a deadly version of rock, paper, scissors, where rock could literally crush scissors. But the glory of being a top-tier gladiator was a double-edged sword, quite literally. Sure, if you survived long enough, you might earn your freedom and even a bit of fame. Some gladiators, like Spartacus, became legends in their own time. But the reality was grim. The average gladiator's career was shorter than a Roman emperor's temper, with many lasting just 3 to 5 fights. And those fights, brutal affairs where the stakes were as high as the Colosseum's towering walls. The brutal training regimens were enough to make a modern boot camp look like a spa retreat. Gladiators trained in *ludi*, or gladiatorial schools, where they were drilled by Lannisty *, part trainer, part taskmaster. These were not your friendly neighborhood coaches, unless your neighborhood was one where barking orders and cracking whips was the norm. Training was relentless, designed to craft the perfect killing machine. Diets were high in carbohydrates to build a bulky physique, ancient carb loading, if you will. And there was no escape from the grind. Lannisty had a vested interest in making sure every fighter was as sharp as a bronze dagger. Let's not forget the economic machinery behind the spectacle. Gladiator fights were a lucrative business, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. The Lannisty were businessmen at heart, making calculated decisions on which gladiators lived or died based on their financial bottom line. A trained gladiator was an investment, after all. And like any good investment, the more you put in, the more you could get out. Assuming, of course, your gladiator wasn't skewered in the arena. But let's address the myth of the noble gladiator head-on. Many of us have a romanticized vision of gladiators as noble warriors fighting for glory and honor. The truth, it was more about grit and survival. The arena was less a stage for heroics and more a brutal reminder of Rome's power and the harsh realities of life. Gladiators fought for the entertainment of others, their lives hanging by the thread of the crowd's whims and the emperor's thumb. This brings us to the social dynamics off the field. Inside the ludus *, gladiators formed bonds, rivalries, and even brotherhoods. It was a fraternity forged in blood and sweat, where loyalty could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, despite the camaraderie, the specter of betrayal always loomed, as the prospect of freedom was a powerful motivator. Even the public perception of gladiators was a mixed bag. On one hand, they were celebrated figures, immortalized in mosaics and feted by fans. On the other, they were seen as the lowest of the low in Roman society, often barred from marrying free-born women or holding public office. It was a life of paradoxes, adored by the masses, yet shunned by polite society. The gladiatorial games were a microcosm of Roman society itself, a place where the brutal realities of life and death played out for all to see. The games were a reminder of Rome's might and the fragility of life, a spectacle that captivated the ancients just as much as it fascinates us today. So, the next time you think of gladiators, picture less the romanticized warriors of myth and more the gritty, determined fighters they were. For every tale of triumph in the arena, there were countless stories of hardship and struggle, of lives lived on the edge of a blade. The legend may shine brightly, but the reality remains as raw and unyielding as the sand beneath a gladiator's feet. Now, speaking of sand beneath a gladiator's feet, let's zoom out and look at the grand stage itself, the Colosseum. This wasn't just any arena, it was the big kahuna of amphitheaters, a towering testament to Roman engineering and their love for all things grandiose. Imagine a structure standing nearly 160 feet tall, about the height of a 12-story building, and capable of seating 50,000 to 80,000 spectators. No, that's not a typo. The Colosseum was the original megastadium, a precursor to our modern sports arenas, minus the jumbo screens, but definitely with more drama. Built in the 1st century AD under the Flavian dynasty, it was originally known as the Flavian Amphitheatre. But let's be real, Colosseum rolls off the tongue a lot easier. The name was inspired by a colossal statue of Nero that once stood nearby. The Romans loved a good pun, apparently. Constructed out of travertine limestone and tuff, the Colosseum was a marvel of its time, boasting 80 entrances to ensure a swift flow of people. Talk about crowd control. Forget about standing in line at the snack bar. In ancient Rome, you'd queue for a slice of spectacle pie. Now, let's talk seating arrangements, because in Rome, where you sat was as much a statement as what you wore. The social hierarchy was as rigid as a gladiator's muscles. The elite, including senators and equestrians, had front-row seats to the action, quite literally. Meanwhile, the plebeians, or common folk, occupied the nosebleed sections. Women, with the exception of the Vestal virgins, were relegated to the highest tiers, lest their delicate sensibilities be offended by the carnage below. It was a veritable who's who of Roman society, a social ladder where everyone had their rung. The logistics of hosting such massive events would make even the most seasoned event planner break a sweat. We're talking about coordinating thousands of people, not to mention the menagerie of animals and fighters involved. The Colosseum was equipped with an elaborate system of elevators and trapdoors. Think of it as a deadly version of a magic show, where instead of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, you might release a lion onto the arena floor. The spectacles were meticulously planned, with a typical day featuring a morning of animal hunts, followed by public executions at midday, and culminating in the gladiatorial battles everyone was clamoring for. And who footed the bill for these extravagant affairs? Enter the emperors, those master showmen who understood that nothing won over a crowd like a bit of blood and spectacle. These games were more than just entertainment. They were a tool of political propaganda, a way to keep the masses happy and distracted. It was the ultimate bread and circus routine, a strategy to maintain the delicate balance of power in a city teetering on the edge of chaos. Emperors like Nero and Commodus, who had an uncanny talent for spectacle, used these events to bolster their image. Let's pause for a moment on Nero, a man who could give any reality TV star a run for their money. Known for his artistic ambitions and questionable sanity, Nero didn't just want to be a ruler, he wanted to be adored. His games were as lavish as they were infamous, featuring everything from chariot races to mock naval battles. He even participated in some events himself, though in all fairness, he probably didn't risk as much as a gladiator did. The Colosseum was his stage, and Rome his audience, and Nero played them like a virtuoso. Then there was Commodus, the emperor who didn't just watch the games, he starred in them. Imagine your country's leader stepping into the ring alongside professional fighters, and you get a sense of Commodus, flair for the dramatic. He fancied himself a demigod, often dressing as Hercules and battling in the arena. It was a PR stunt on steroids, designed to cement his image as a warrior emperor. But while the crowds may have cheered, history remembers him as more of a tyrant than a hero. The games were a reflection of the emperor's need for control, a way to assert dominance over both the populace and the empire itself. They were a means of distraction, a way to appease the public and prevent unrest. When you're dealing with a city of over 1 million people, keeping them entertained isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity. The Colosseum was the entertainment hub of its time, and the emperor was its star producer. But as with all good things, there was a catch. The lavish spectacles were funded by the state coffers, and as with any government spending, it was the taxpayers who ultimately footed the bill. The games were a financial drain, a costly endeavor that required careful management. And while the crowd cheered, the state bled money faster than a wounded gladiator. The economic burden of these games was a constant balancing act, one that required both savvy and charisma to maintain. So, as we step back from the roar of the crowd and the sands of the arena, we see the games for what they truly were. A complex interplay of politics, economics, and spectacle. They were a stage where emperors played out their ambitions and the people reveled in the drama. The Colosseum was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of Rome's might, a testament to its love for grandeur, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest stories are those written in blood and sand. And as we prepare to dive deeper into this world, one thing is for sure. The stories from the Colosseum's shadowy corridors are far from over. So, as we leave behind the grandeur and architectural genius of the Colosseum, let's dive into the pulsating heart of these spectacles, the crowd. Because what's a gladiator fight without an audience to cheer, jeer, and occasionally decide the fate of the combatants with a flick of the emperor's thumb? The Romans were nothing if not enthusiastic spectators, and their passion for the games was matched only by their love of intricate plumbing and spicy garum sauce. Now, if you think today's sports fans are intense, you haven't met a Roman crowd. Picture it. Tens of thousands of toga-clad citizens packed into the Colosseum, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of olive oil. These were the ultimate reality TV viewers, except their shows were live, unscripted, and came with a body count. The crowd's roar was the lifeblood of the games, a symphony of humanity that could sway the outcome as surely as a well-placed blow from a gladiator's sword. But it wasn't all about bloodlust. Oh no, the Roman audience was a complex beast. For them, the games were more than just entertainment. They were a deeply ingrained cultural phenomenon. Gladiatorial contests mirrored the values of Roman society: strength, bravery, and the ever-present dance with mortality. In the arena, the Romans saw a reflection of their own world, a place where life was precarious and power was fleeting. And let's not forget the social aspect. The games were as much about networking as they were about neck-snapping. It was a place to see and be seen, where Roman citizens rubbed shoulders with senators and merchants alike. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a corporate skybox, where deals were made over a goblet of wine and a shared appreciation for a well-executed disembowelment. The crowd's role extended beyond mere spectatorship. They were active participants, their voices a powerful force that could save a gladiator or seal his doom. The infamous thumbs-up or thumbs-down gesture, immortalized by Hollywood, is shrouded in myth. In truth, the decision was more nuanced. The emperor held the ultimate power, thumbs positioned however he pleased, but the crowd's opinion often guided his judgment. And if there's one thing we know about human nature, it's that a mob's opinion can be as fickle as a Roman's summer breeze. Speaking of fickle, let's talk about the mob mentality that gripped Rome during these spectacles. The romanticized image of a Roman citizen as a noble, rational thinker often crumbles under the weight of historical reality. When packed into the Colosseum, the crowd became a single entity, driven by emotions as raw and unpredictable as the battles they watched. The games were a release valve for societal tensions, a place where the Roman populace could escape the drudgeries of daily life and indulge in the chaos of the arena. And while we're busting myths, let's address the idea of the games as purely a tool of control. Sure, they were a brilliant distraction from political unrest and economic woes, but they were more than just a smoke and mirrors act by the emperors. The games were a genuine expression of Roman identity, a celebration of their martial prowess, and a testament to their gods. In a world where life was often brutal and short, the games offered a form of catharsis, a way to confront the harsh realities of existence head-on. Economically speaking, the games were a boon for certain sectors of Roman society. Vendors hawked everything from snacks to souvenirs, and the influx of visitors during major events meant a bustling trade for local businesses. The games were like a mini economic stimulus package, boosting everything from food sales to accommodation. Yet, beneath this veneer of prosperity lay the stark reality of social inequality. The games were free to attend, thanks to the benevolence, or strategic politicking, of the emperor, but the societal divisions were as clear as the tiers of seating in the Colosseum. The plebeians, or commoners, might have enjoyed free admission, but they were reminded of their place every time they squinted from the nosebleed seats. Meanwhile, the elite lounged in the prime spots, their status reinforced by proximity to the action. It was the ultimate class divide on display, a microcosm of Roman society played out in stone and sand. The games were a reminder that while the Roman Empire was vast and powerful, its citizens were bound by the rigid hierarchies that defined their world. In the swirling chaos of the games, the crowd found both unity and division. They cheered for their favorite gladiators with a fervor that rivaled any modern sports fan, yet the underlying tensions of Roman life were never far from the surface. The games were a paradox, a unifying force that highlighted the divisions within Roman society. They were a stage upon which the dramas of life and death unfolded, a place where the harsh realities of existence were both celebrated and mourned. As we pull back the curtain on this ancient spectacle, we see a world both familiar and alien. The Colosseum was more than just an arena. It was a reflection of Rome itself, a living testament to the complexities of human nature. The games captivated the Roman imagination, just as they continue to fascinate us today. And as we prepare to explore further, one thing is certain. The story of the gladiatorial games is far from over. As we journey through the fading echoes of gladiatorial cheers, it's time to face the twilight of these iconic spectacles. The decline of gladiator fights wasn't an overnight curtain call. It was more like a slow fade into the background as Rome itself shuffled toward a new era. This wasn't just about the emperor having an epiphany over breakfast. No, it was a complex tango of economic strains, political shifts, and a growing moral unease that eventually dimmed the lights on this blood-soaked stage. Let's start with the economy, because, as in any era, money talks, and in this case, it grumbled. Gladiator games were not exactly a budget-friendly affair. By the 3rd century AD, Rome's purse strings were tighter than the leather straps on a gladiator's armor. The empire was sprawling, its resources stretched like a toga on laundry day. Funding lavish games became a bit like trying to host a champagne party on a vinegar budget. The emperors, eyeing their dwindling coffers, started to reconsider the cost of keeping the masses entertained with such pricey spectacles. Politically, the winds were shifting too. As Christianity began to spread its roots across the empire, the moral compass started to point away from the bloodlust of the arena. With the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, Emperor Constantine, who was himself no stranger to a good PR stunt, legalized Christianity, setting the stage for a cultural shift. Gladiator games, once the highlight of the Roman social calendar, were increasingly viewed as incompatible with Christian doctrines of mercy and compassion. The Church, with its growing influence, wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole entertainment by evisceration concept. But it wasn't just the money and morals on the chopping block. Rome itself was crumbling under the weight of its own expansion. By the late 4th century, external threats were more pressing than internal entertainment. The empire was under siege from all sides, Goths knocking at the gates like uninvited party crashers. When you're worried about the Visigoths, it's hard to focus on organizing a gladiatorial spectacular. Plus, the constant state of war meant potential gladiators were more useful on the battlefield than in the arena. The last nails in the coffin came courtesy of Emperor Honorius, who, in 404 AD, put the kibosh on gladiator games once and for all. The final straw was the martyrdom of a monk named Telemachus, who leapt into the arena to stop a fight and was promptly stoned to death by the crowd. Honorius, perhaps swayed by this display of faith or simply fed up with the whole affair, officially banned the games. And just like that, the roar of the Colosseum faded to silence. Yet the legacy of the gladiators was far from buried beneath the sands. Their echoes reverberate through history, immortalized not only in crumbling mosaics, but in the very fabric of our modern culture. Look no further than the silver screen, where Hollywood has taken the gladiator mythos and run with it faster than a asterisk Rechiarius, fleeing a asterisk secutor asterisk. From the 1950s epics like Spartacus to the 2000 blockbuster Gladiator. These stories have been polished to a high sheen of drama and heroism, often glossing over the grim realities of arena life in favor of sweeping narratives and tear-jerking speeches. Let's not forget sports, where the spirit of the gladiatorial games lives on in our collective obsession with competition. Whether it's the boxing ring, the football field, or the UFC octagon, the echoes of the Colosseum can be heard in the chants of fans and the clash of athletes. We've traded swords for helmets and shields for gloves, but the primal thrill of the contest remains as potent as ever. The desire to witness human struggle and triumph, to see strength and skill pushed to their limits, is a legacy that refuses to die. And then there's the myth-busting allure of the gladiator. We love a good underdog story, a tale of grit and resilience against the odds. The romanticized vision of the noble gladiator, fighting not just for survival, but for honor and glory, continues to captivate our imagination. It's a narrative that, while not entirely accurate, embodies our fascination with the extraordinary individuals who stood in the arena, facing their fate with courage and defiance. In reflecting on the gladiators' legacy, it's crucial to acknowledge the duality of their existence. They were symbols of Roman might and brutality, entertainers and slaves, warriors and victims. Their story is a reminder of humanity's capacity for both glory and cruelty, for spectacle and savagery. The myth endures because it speaks to something fundamental within us, a recognition of life's inherent conflict and the indomitable spirit that strives to overcome it. As we close the book on the gladiators, we see them not as relics of a bygone era, but as enduring figures in our cultural consciousness. Their legacy is one of contradiction and complexity, a testament to the enduring power of myth and the inescapable draw of the human story. In the end, the gladiator games were more than just a spectacle. They were a reflection of the world around them, a world not so different from our own, where the line between legend and reality is as thin as the blade of a Roman sword. So, next time you find yourself enthralled by a sports match or captivated by a cinematic epic, remember the gladiators. They may have left the arena centuries ago, but their legacy lives on in the stories we tell and the games we play. As long as there's an audience to cheer and a competitor willing to risk it all, the spirit of the gladiator will never truly fade.